The beef stew was good. That was the first thing I noticed. 3 years of dry rations and stable floors, and the first meal at my new job was hot, salted, and served on an actual plate. I signed the last page of the offer letter and slid it across the desk. Alice caught it with 2 fingers, barely looking up from her wine glass. She was already laughing before she read the terms. "You have a wicked personality," she said. "What do you think the hero is doing right now?" I set my pen down, picked up the spoon. The stew had actual beef in it, which was more than Alvin had ever budgeted for. "Finding out," I said. I had canceled the auto payment on his Holy Sword subscription 3 months ago. The Inn VIP contract, the potion delivery, the guild line of credit, the corrected tax declaration to the tax office. All of it queued on my tablet, timed to the minute. I had been checking job listings for 6 months. The resignation letter had been in my desk drawer since spring. The cancellations were the parting signature I held back for the day I finally walked. Alvin had fired me that morning. He stood in the guild hall with his arms crossed and told me I was too meticulous about expenses. His exact words were that I slowed the party down with paperwork and that a real adventurer did not need a receipt for every potion. Mina laughed from behind him, the way she always laughed at things she did not understand. The rest of the party said nothing. They never said anything. 3 years I kept his books. 3 years of filing his taxes, managing his equipment leases, submitting his dungeon permits, correcting his expense reports. He never read a single one. He never asked what I did all day. He just knew the sword worked when he swung it, and the inn had a bed when he came back. I said I understood. I handed him the pre-written resignation. I walked out. By the time I sat down at this table, every form was filed. I filed. Alice tilted her glass. He should be finding out about the sword right around now. Somewhere in a dragon's lair on the other side of the continent, a notification window was floating above Alvin's head. Subscription lapsed. Unpaid invoice. Service terminated. The holy sword he had been swinging for 3 years went from luminous to gray mid-stroke. He shouted my name for a spare, then remembered he had fired me that morning. The dragon noticed before he did. He survived. The dungeon's emergency system teleported him out for failing to submit the S-rank entry form 3 days in advance by fax. His quest reward was confiscated. He was dragged to the guild branch chief's office for a scolding like a clerk who had lost the company card. Alice opened a bag of chips. I reached for one. "Agreed," I said. "Let us open some chips." We played video games until midnight. The beds at the Demon King's castle had actual mattresses. I slept 9 hours for the first time in 3 years. The next morning, I walked to the hot spring. The castle had one. It was called something dramatic. The water was perfect. I sat in it for 40 minutes and felt the 3 years of tension leave my shoulders one knot at a time. I was sitting in a massage chair, drinking fruit milk when my tablet chimed. The caller ID read, "Former boss." I pressed accept and activated the billing timer. 5,000 mana per minute. Guild-regulated consultation rate for an S-rank accountant. The Adventurers Guild had set those rates. I had filed the paperwork to qualify for them 2 years ago. On a lunch break, Alvin did not notice. Alvin screamed something about the inn. His voice was hoarse. Apparently, his VIP plan had been downgraded to economy overnight. 3 months retroactive with interest. The bed was rock hard. Breakfast was burnt bread crusts and cloudy water. The receptionist would not make eye contact. I told him I had already resigned and had no obligation to follow work orders. He kept shouting. I mentioned the emergency surcharge. 1 minute later, his account had dropped from 5,050 mana to 50. He was being billed for the privilege of yelling at me. After the call, I filed the inventory recovery notice. Every piece of equipment in Alvin's party had been purchased through contracts I managed. The potions, the spare mithril set, the S-rank monster materials. 1 million mana worth of gear, technically my procurement, legally recoverable upon contract termination. By noon, it was done. Alice poked her head into the lounge. "Sushi for lunch." "Expensed," I said. The slums of the human capital smelled like wet wood and resignation. I walked through them with my audit tablet under my arm, stepping over puddles that had been there long enough to develop opinions. Gant was sitting against a wall at the end of the alley. Former S-rank heavy warrior. The man they used to call the Iron Wall. His right leg was discolored and bent at an angle that made my audit sense itch before I even ran the numbers. He looked up when I stopped in front of him. His eyes were flat. "Cliff?" He said my name like he was not sure it was still in circulation. "You here to laugh?" I crouched down and held the tablet over his leg. The audit mode activated, a cascade of light tracing the fracture line, cross-referencing the guild's after-action report, calculating the avoidance probability, 98%. The dragon attack that broke his leg was survivable if Alvin had not ordered him to hold position instead of dodging. The guild report called it an accident. My tablet called it what it was. "Command error," I said. "Guild law, Article 108. Full compensation from the party leader." Gant stared at me. His mouth opened, then closed. I made the offer plain. 300 million mana from the guild's workers' compensation insurance fund, filed as a negligence claim against Alvin. My commission was 20%. The remaining 240 million went to Gant. I would handle every form, every threat, every conversation with the branch chief who would try to bury it. "What do you want me to do?" His voice was low, careful, the voice of a man who had stopped expecting things. "Get your leg fixed, eat a hot meal, and when you can walk again, come work for me as chief of security at the Demon King's castle." I closed the tablet. "The cafeteria serves steak, all you can eat." He looked at his leg, then at me, then at the tablet. "Deal," he said. The guild receptionist told me the claim would not go through. I set the dossier on the counter. It was thick enough to prop open a door. Evidence logs, medical audit traces, the original after-action report with Alvin's signature on the order that broke Gant's leg, and a highlighted copy of Article 108 with the relevant clause circled twice. She looked at it. She looked at me. I mentioned that the gossip magazine Weekly Exposure had expressed interest in guild insurance fraud stories. The branch chief appeared from the back office in under a minute. The claim was approved before the receptionist finished her sentence. Gant's tablet chimed. 240 million mana. He stared at the number so long I thought the screen had frozen. His eyes were wet. He thanked me in a voice that did not match his size. "No need," I said. It was a legitimate claim. He followed me out of the guild office and into the carriage waiting at the curb. He did not ask where we were going. He did not need to. The casino was called the Gold Rush. It had a golden facade and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been audited. Alice and I sat at the cafe across the street. She had a potato in one hand and a floating hologram in the other, the hologram showing a live feed of the casino's VIP room. Alvin was inside, hunched over a roulette table with 1 million mana in borrowed chips. He was betting it all on red. His holy sword was still active, and he believed its luck boost would save him. Alice pulled up the sword's internal code on the hologram and tilted it so I could see. "The advertised luck boost is 20%, she said. "The actual value is 0.01%. She scrolled deeper. A hidden subroutine sat in the code like a roach in a cupboard. Her eyebrow went up. "There is a program called Goblin Timer. It triggers forced failure after 1 year, or when the stakes go high enough. The whole thing is built to break." I picked up the communication stone and called the manufacturer, Royal Capital Weapons Company, Public Relations Department. The voice on the other end was nervous before I finished my first sentence. I explained that I had the internal audit data on the Goblin Timer. I mentioned Weekly Exposure again. I suggested that a quiet termination of Alvin's sponsorship contract under breach of conduct would be far less expensive than an industry-wide fraud investigation. The voice on the other end agreed in under 30 seconds. Inside the casino, the roulette ball was still spinning. The notification window appeared above Alvin's sword. Sponsorship terminated. The blade lost its glow and went dull. The ball landed on black. 1 million mana, gone. Borrowed from a loan shark, wagered on a fraud, lost to a rigged wheel that stopped being rigged at the exact moment it mattered. Alvin sank to the floor. The crowd around him was already laughing. I finished my coffee. Alice was looking at me with the expression she used when she was about to suggest something expensive. "Shopping?" she said. "I want a new keyboard." "Expensed," I said. I pulled out my tablet and made a note. Alvin had hidden offshore accounts, paper companies sheltering mana from the tax bureau. I had known about them for 2 years. I had never filed the report because I had been his employee, and employees do not audit their own boss. I was not his employee anymore. The note read, "Tax Bureau, first thing in the morning." That seemed fine to me. The tax return was almost beautiful in how badly it lied. I spread the sheets across my desk and let the numbers speak. Taxable income reported 0. Expenses denied on review. $2 million in training costs that never happened. $1.5 million in luxury consumables. $2 million in casino losses claimed as research. Alice had her feet up on the edge of my desk, working through a second cup of premium Demon Realm pudding she had filed under welfare expenses. The offshore trail, she said between spoonfuls. She flicked a screen toward me. 400 million mana, routed through a shell company registered in the 7th offshore labyrinth, outside the kingdom's tax jurisdiction, the kind of place where money goes to lose its name. I corrected the return in black ink. Taxable income, 5 million mana. Estimated penalties with the heavy surtax, 500 million. Then I put on my coat and told Alice we had an appointment with a legend. Hilda's office smelled like old paper and the kind of silence that makes junior auditors cry. She sat behind a desk stacked with case files, monocle already glowing a faint green. They called her the vampire of the capital, and watching her flip through my evidence, I understood why. She moved through the pages the way a predator moves through tall grass, without hurry, without doubt. She finished in under a minute, looked up at me with that monocle still shimmering, and told me, in a voice that sounded like a court order being read aloud, that she hated tax evaders more than she hated the Demon King, that the people's money spent on private vanity deserved to be hunted to the edge of the world. I told her about the 5 million in unreported income and the 400 million offshore. She was already reaching for the raid authorization stamp before I finished the sentence. The heavy tax nights blew the gate off its hinges at 4:30. Alice, Gant, and I stood across the street. Gant had his arms folded. Alice was refreshing a social feed on her tablet. I was watching the front door, counting seconds. The nights moved through the mansion like an audit in human form. Every room, every closet, every drawer. Red tags appeared on furniture, on paintings, on a collection of enchanted wine bottles I remembered Alvin bragging about 3 years ago. Then the front doors burst open and the hero came out, not walking, being escorted, handcuffs on, tax nights on each arm, and he was shouting about his connections to royalty, saying he was friends with someone in the palace. That did not seem to matter to the woman in the monocle standing on his lawn, stamp in hand. Behind him came Mina, and she was not shouting about connections. She was shouting about her bags, luxury designer bags. She screamed that they were gifts from fans, clutching at one as a knight pulled it away and slapped a red tag on the clasp. It was the sort of panic you see from someone who has never lost anything that cost more than her sense of shame. I watched them get loaded into the transport carriage. The social feeds were already exploding. The hashtag was trending before they cleared the driveway. Something settled in my chest, a knot I had been carrying since the day Alvin told me I was useless and signed my termination without reading what it cost him. The knot was gone. I had collected my unpaid wages, with interest, at an industry standard finder's fee. I was about to tell Alice to pack up when my tablet chimed. An anonymous message, no sender ID, subject line, confidential. I opened it. A guild insider, someone in the accounting department. They had seen the trending arrest and concluded I was the only auditor in the kingdom who would chase a lead instead of selling it. The email said Alvin did not build his tax evasion scheme alone. A guild executive had designed the whole structure, a mastermind I had never heard of. I stared at the screen for a long moment. My peaceful leave-on-time life, the one I had been planning since the day I walked into the Demon King's castle, flickered once and went dark. Overtime, I said. Alice looked up from her pudding. With holiday pay, her eyes lit up. She asked if the budget would cover the limited edition Demon Realm pudding at 3,000 mana per cup. I told her I would approve it. She was already pulling up the guild's financial records before I finished the sentence. The guild's numbers were a disaster dressed in a suit. Alice had the last 3 years of the branch's finances on her screens. Adventurer rewards had been cut in half. Conference expenses had gone up 1,600%. I pulled a specific receipt. 500,000 mana, billed at an upscale private members club, logged at 11 at night, filed under conference costs. Alice's spoon stopped midair. I picked up my satchel. Let's go. Holiday overtime starts now. Gaston's office looked like the inside of a jewelry box owned by a man with no taste. Gold trim on every surface, velvet chairs, a desk large enough to land a dragon on. The branch chief himself was round and sweating before I even said a word. I laid the receipt on his desk. 500,000 mana, an upscale private members club. 11 at night, filed as a business meeting. I asked him to explain. He stammered that it was a critical management conference, high-level strategy, very important. I activated instant audit. The skill reached into the room's financial records and began surfacing hidden accounts. Red flags appeared across my display. Unreported income, diverted funds, a slush fund the size of a small kingdom's annual budget. Then a voice came from the back of the room, pale skin, eyes like a snake deciding whether to strike. A leather-bound book under one arm. Viper stepped out from behind a curtain with the calm of someone who had been waiting there since breakfast. He told me, in a voice smooth enough to pour, that I should not bully his important client. He produced a sheet of paper, forged minutes for a meeting that never happened, an agenda debating future adventurer training policy, signatures from people who were probably asleep at the time. He cited Guild Law Article 28. A meeting is considered valid regardless of venue as long as a record exists. Then he opened the Holy Law Compendium. The book pulsed. Viper said one word: objection. My audit display shuddered. Every red flag I had surfaced flickered, then turned green, one by one, like lights being switched off in a building I was standing inside. The hidden accounts were still there. I could feel them, but the system no longer recognized them as hidden. Viper's skill had injected a legal definition into the audit layer, and definitions apparently trumped data. Alice made a sound behind me, disbelief. She had never seen my skill overridden. Gaston started laughing, a wet, triumphant sound that filled the gold-trimmed room. Viper told me I had committed defamation and obstruction of business. He mentioned a 10 billion mana lawsuit with the lightness of someone mentioning lunch plans. I noted that. Gant, Alice, we are pulling out. Gant stared at me, asked if we were really retreating. I told him we were. We left through the front door, while Gaston's laughter followed us down the hallway. I pinned the floor plan to the wall and marked the branch chief's office on the top floor. Alice was sitting cross-legged on my desk, chewing a gummy candy to stay awake. Gant leaned against the doorframe with his arms folded. I explained the rule I had learned. Objection rewrites interpretation. It operates on the legal record system. It turns red to green by changing what the system considers valid, but it cannot rewrite a physical object. A notebook in a safe is not a legal record until someone enters it into the system. A recording stone in a drawer is not testimony until someone plays it in court. If we took the original evidence out of the building before Viper could define it away, his skill was just a book. We need the black ledger, I said, and anything else that's safe is hiding. Gant was already moving. He crossed the room, opened a storage locker, and pulled out a set of work overalls with a cleaning company's logo stitched on the chest. He held them up with 2 fingers and a look that said he had opinions about the wardrobe. As a former S-rank tank, he said, I am an expert at managing enemy sightlines. I know where they watch and where the blind spots are. He put the overalls on. They fit poorly and perfectly at the same time. The mop was a nice touch. 2 in the morning. A wagon parked on a side street behind the guild branch. Inside, 3 stone tablet monitors, a keyboard Alice had wired to the guild's external mana network port, and me. Alice's fingers moved across the keys. Camera feeds looped. Magical sensors dimmed to sleep mode. She said the guild's security was weak. The Demon King's castle's back entrance was harder to crack. I believed her. Gant's voice came through the communication stone. Clear reception. He was inside, moving through the back corridors with the mop and a janitor's quiet confidence. He reached the branch chief's door. Magical lock. Alice cracked the password in 4 seconds. She read it back to me with the tone of someone who had given up on humanity. Gaston _love_money, followed by 4 digits that I will not repeat because she made me promise to forget them. The door opened. Gant stepped inside. A mithril safe sat in the corner. Maximum security, dual biometric authentication, fingerprint, and mana wave. The kind of safe that costs more than most people's houses. I told Gant to place the stone tablet from his pocket against the lock panel. The tablet I had left on Gaston's desk that afternoon. The one I placed there while he was sweating through my questions. It had been scanning his residual fingerprints and mana signature the entire time he was sitting behind that desk, trying not to vomit. Alice spoofed the biometric match. The safe clicked open. Inside, stacks of Magic Seal banknotes, a small black notebook, and a recording stone the size of a walnut. "Found it," Gant said. He pocketed the notebook and the stone. Then his voice dropped. Someone was coming. Footsteps in the corridor, not a regular guard. Silent movement, sharp intent. Viper had stationed someone better. Gant did not sound worried. He told me not to underestimate a former S-rank tank. His skill activated. Silent fortress, 0 decibels. The sound of the takedown did not exist. 1 second the patroller was standing. The next, he was on the floor at 1% health, unconscious until morning. 1 hour later, Gant was back at the castle, dropping the notebook and the stone on my desk with the casual precision of a man delivering groceries. I played the recording. Gaston's voice, nervous, oily, asking if the under-the-table money processing would be discovered. Then Viper's voice, smooth as fresh ink, assuring him that with his legal interpretation, even black becomes white. I smiled. It was the second time in 2 phases. I noted that. The annual shareholders meeting opened the way they always do. Reports, numbers, a podium. Gaston stood at the front with Viper at his side, presenting a financial report so clean it could have been printed in a church. The investors sat in tiered gallery seats. Nobles, finance officials, the people whose money funded the guild. The chandeliers above cast a warm, formal glow across 200 faces that had no idea what was about to happen to their afternoon. I had the notebook in my satchel and the recording stone in my coat pocket. I could feel the stone's weight against my ribs, small enough to fit in a palm, heavy enough to end a career. I waited until the applause for the quarterly dividend died down. Then I stood. "I have an objection." The room turned. Gaston's face went white. Viper's did not. He looked at me the way you look at a fly that has come back through the same window twice. I produced the black notebook, the true account book. I held it up so the gallery could see it. Gaston's handwriting, Gaston's ink, entries the false report had erased. I let the silence around the notebook do the talking for a beat. 200 pairs of eyes tracked the notebook from my hand to the air above my head. Viper spoke before anyone else could. His voice filled the hall with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this. He cited the poison tree doctrine. "Evidence obtained through illegal means," he said, "is inadmissible in any proceeding. The notebook was stolen. Therefore, it did not exist as evidence. Therefore, nothing I said had legal standing." He delivered it the way a surgeon delivers a prognosis. Compassionate, final. I let him finish. Then I looked at the investors. "You are not a court," I said. The room paused. I could hear a chair creak 3 rows back. "You are the owners. You funded this guild with your capital. You are not bound by the rules of a courtroom. You are bound by whether your money is safe." I set the recording stone on the podium. It clicked against the wood, and right now, it is not. I pressed the stone. Gaston's voice filled the assembly hall. That nervous, oily voice asking whether the under-the-table money processing would be discovered. The words echoed off the marble, and the high vaulted ceiling turned them into a confession that reached every seat. Then Viper's reply, the one where he promised to make black into white, followed by a laugh that the investors in the front row heard with their jaws slowly unhinging. For a moment, the room held its breath. I watched the realization travel through the gallery in a wave, front row first, then the middle tiers, then the nobles in the back, who were slower because they were richer and therefore less accustomed to believing they had been robbed. The gallery erupted, not with applause, with fury. Chairs scraped, voices climbed over each other. A nobleman in the 3rd row stood and demanded an immediate freeze on all guild branch assets. A finance official behind him seconded it. Another voice from the back called for a full investigation. The anger spread through the gallery like fire through dry receipts, and I stood at the center of it and did not move. This was the part I had been planning for. Not the evidence, not the legal argument, the crowd. Viper's skill could rewrite interpretation. It could turn red flags green, but it operated on a system, and systems answer to the people who fund them. My instant audit skill drew on stakeholder approval. At 100%, it unlocked a threshold I had never reached before. The display lit, hidden accounts surfaced, not as red flags this time, as asset seizures. The numbers cascaded across my screen in columns of frozen mana, each one a thread pulled from Gaston's fabric. Viper opened the Holy Law Compendium. Purple chains of legal magic coiled out of the pages and wrapped around my audit display, trying to strangle the execution. I watched them form. In my head, I described them the way I would describe an asset class about to be shorted: overvalued, structurally dependent on a single counterparty, catastrophically exposed to a change in market sentiment. The chains shattered. The sound was not loud. It was the sound of something that had never been as strong as it looked admitting it. Definitions do not trump owners. Legal magic cannot overwrite the people whose money built the institution. The system bent to the weight of capital, and capital had decided it was angry. 80 million mana in hidden accounts froze in place. The heavy tax debuff landed on Gaston and on Viper. I had read about the effect, but never seen it in person. The embezzled funds materialized as visible mass on their bodies. Gaston dropped to his knees under the weight of his own corruption, gasping, his suit crumpling against the marble floor. Viper staggered, his legs buckled. The compendium slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a sound like a verdict. Tax Knights stepped forward. They hauled Viper toward the exit. He went without resisting, but he turned his head as they dragged him past me. His eyes found mine. His voice was lower now, stripped of the theater. He told me that as long as law existed in this world, he would find a way back. A plea bargain, an appeal, a procedural loophole. He would return. I noted that. I believed him. Gaston collapsed at the podium. He did not have a speech prepared for this version of the meeting. The hall went quiet, not the quiet of a room where nothing is happening, the quiet of a room where something has finished, and everyone in it knows it. I stood in the silence and let it settle. 3 years of filing receipts for a hero who never learned my name. 3 years of keeping the lights on for a party that treated me like furniture. The wages I was owed had been collected, with interest, in a currency Alvin would never understand. The debt was closed, not with a punch or a spell or a dramatic declaration, with a recording stone the size of a walnut and a room full of angry investors. Then, the air behind me split open. A vertical tear in the space between the podium and the back wall. Dark energy poured out of it like smoke from a furnace. The investors who had been standing sat back down. The tax knights near the door reached for their weapons and then decided not to. A figure stepped through the gate, tall, broad, crimson eyes that swept the room the way a general surveys a battlefield he has already won. The dark energy settled around his shoulders like a cloak he had been wearing since before anyone in this room was born. Every investor in the gallery pressed back into their seat. The tax knights near the door lowered their hands from their weapons. Not because they were ordered to, because their instincts told them to. Alice moved, not toward me, past me. She was running before I understood why, her silver hair streaming behind her, and the word she shouted stopped me where I stood. Papa! The word hit the silence like a stone dropping into still water. The Demon King looked down at her, and his expression shifted into something warmer than the room deserved. He put one hand on her head, gentle, the same hand that could probably level a city block. He said something to her, quiet, just for her. Then he looked at me. He called me the rumored ace accountant. He said his army's elite had spoken highly of my work. He congratulated me on the audit. And then, without any particular ceremony, he asked if I would like to audit his world conquest plan's budget. He mentioned that his army had a deficit, that he had perhaps been too generous with the meal plan, that someone who could read a balance sheet might save him from his own charity. I looked at Alice. She was standing next to her father with both hands on his arm, trying to look casual about the fact that she had just revealed the Demon King of the entire realm was her dad. The 6 months of onboarding, the pudding budget, the late night code sessions, the wine at the signing dinner, a family operation the whole time. I considered my peaceful retirement for exactly the time it takes to blink. Then I let it go. I will need a desk, I said, and a budget for overtime. The Demon King said I could have both. Alice said the pudding came with the desk. Gant behind me said nothing, which was his way of saying everything. I looked at the dark gate still shimmering in the air behind my new employer and made a note that the next chapter of my career would at least come with a desk that was not haunted by Alvin's name. The contract had gotten considerably more interesting, and I had a feeling the budget was going to be terrible. That seemed fine to me. The throne room smelled like polish and overspending. Zane sat on a chair 3 times too large for any conversation that wasn't a declaration of war, and what he declared was a salary. 50 million mana per year, full benefits, housing in the castle's east wing, paid vacation he would never let me take. Alice sat cross-legged in a gaming chair she had apparently dragged up 6 flights of stairs, sucking on a lollipop and not looking at anyone. Gant stood by the door with his arms folded, already measuring the exits out of professional habit. I did not accept. Before I decide anything, I said, "Let me see the books." Zane's smile held for exactly 1 second. Then the ledger arrived, and the smile died on the table next to it. Revenue, 1 billion mana. Expenses, 1.3 billion. Annual deficit, 300 million. Compounding. The demon army was bleeding out through line items labeled Hero Training Support Fund, Disaster Relief for Border Villages, and Employee Welfare, pudding, which was a real entry that someone had approved with a stamp. I closed the ledger. "You have 6 months before this army shuts down." Alice stopped mid-lick. Gant's arms unfolded. Zane had bankrupted his own kingdom by being kind. Anonymous donations to orphaned humans, subsidized meals for every subordinate, charitable grants to organizations that would never know the money came from a demon king. He was running a nonprofit with the overhead of an empire and the revenue model of a lemonade stand. "You are too generous to lead a budget," I said. It was not a compliment. "Every mana that leaves this treasury without my signature is a mana that kills this army," he protested. Alice cut him off. "Papa, he is right. You spend money like you are allergic to having it." I rewrote the offer letter on the spot. CFO with full budgetary veto. Every disbursement above a threshold required my stamp. Zane retained military command. I controlled everything that had a number attached to it. He signed without reading the clause about having his personal allowance. I signed. The administrative pleasure of watching ink dry on a contract I had written myself was, I decided, the closest thing to joy this job would offer. The first audit landed inside a week. The demon army's monthly holy sword procurement was priced at 1 million mana per blade. Alice ran the numbers in under a minute. Actual manufacturing cost was 50,000. The margin was not a margin. It was theft with a receipt. I refused payment. I brought Gant. We went to the Royal Arms warehouse in the capital. The merchant greeted me at the door with the kind of warmth reserved for people who were about to hand over 100 million mana. I handed him an inspection order instead. He blustered. He mentioned the Holy Knight Commander's personal barrier protecting the 3rd underground warehouse. He called guards. Gant broke the barrier with a single strike. The underground floor shook, and 10,000 replica holy swords sat in their crates behind the rubble, stacked floor to ceiling. Artificial scarcity. The entire market had been rigged by holding back supply and charging the demon army 20 times the real cost. I declared the stock as collateral for damages and ordered every blade sold at cost. Alice broadcast the fire sale to every adventurer's tablet in the capital. Within an hour, the line stretched around the block. The merchant fainted. The guards dropped their own swords when they realized their weapons were worth the same as the replicas flooding the street. I stamped the inspection order closed and made a note. The barrier had been set by the Holy Knight Commander personally, which meant the commander was not just aware of the cartel. He was the cartel. Zegart was at his desk when we walked in unannounced. He shouted about jurisdiction. Gant had already handled the guards on the way up, which I mentioned once, politely, and did not elaborate on. I activated the audit display. 528 expense reports filed under nightly Holy Sword skill training, decoded one by one into what they actually were. Luxury private clubs, high-end restaurants, a venue called the Rabbit Hole, a place called the Dark Emperor that was not a restaurant at all. 350 million mana of the Holy Knight's operational budget, redirected into Zegart's personal entertainment, and laundered through false line items. He went through every stage. Denial first, he swore by the gods. Then reframing, it was information gathering, he claimed. Research into demon ecology. Then begging, when Alice pressed the key that froze all 18 of his accounts, and his displayed balance dropped to 0. I set a receipt on his desk. "The concierge you favored at your preferred venue," I said. "She has been a demon army intelligence officer for the past 3 years. Every receipt she filed went into our records before yours." The blood drained from his face, the way money had drained from his budget. I walked out. We made it home before the end of the business day. The 350 million went into the general fund, and I made a note that the demon army's counterintelligence network was considerably better resourced than I had assumed. The recovered money sat in a bank book on the conference table. Zane proposed distributing figurines of Alice to boost morale. He had a drawing. It was detailed. Alice gave him a look that could have stripped paint off a warship. I stamped the proposal rejected before he finished the sentence. Private expense. Buy them with your allowance. Alice requested a water-cooled Mana data center for her server room. The current setup was overheating, lagging, and costing processing time on every operation she ran. I approved it. The CTO's infrastructure was the brain of the organization, and brains do not run well at furnace temperatures. She also asked for a dedicated snack refrigerator. I told her to buy her own. Cliff, I like you, she said, and meant the server. Gant reported that the logistics chain was failing. Skeleton couriers were complaining about backstrain. Supply runs that should take hours were taking days. I approved autonomous logistics golems, self-driving transport units that could run around the clock. Within a week, the results came back. Logistics costs dropped to a quarter of what they had been. Server processing went from sluggish to instantaneous. The freed budget upgraded the employee cafeteria from standard rations to something the staff actually wanted to eat. Morale climbed without a single figurine. Zane asked if the figurine budget could be reconsidered. I signed the rejection a second time. The next morning, I incorporated the Demon Army as Demon Holdings Cabarge Lemordide. The structure was straightforward. Zane held majority common stock. The company gained cross-jurisdictional standing for asset acquisition, which meant we could buy, audit, and restructure any entity in any territory, a legal tool I was going to need sooner than anyone expected. I retained CFO authority through the budgetary veto clause and gave Zane a golden share with takeover veto rights, because sending the Demon King into a shareholder vote without armor was the kind of negligence I did not practice. Then Carmilla arrived. She walked into the audience chamber like she had built it and was deciding whether to renovate. Deep red dress, fan in one hand, the posture of someone who had been wealthy for longer than most nations had existed. The Blood Empress. She offered 100 billion mana for 51% of the company and demanded that all employees wear gothic ceremonial robes and batwing capes to staff meetings. Zane nearly choked. He looked at the money. He looked at the capes. He looked at me. I refuse, I said. I projected the valuation. Enterprise value after the digital transformation, 2 trillion mana. At that figure, her 100 billion bought 5% non-voting. I offered exactly that. Her fan snapped shut. She called me an insolent little glasses wearer, which I chose to interpret as professional respect. Then she smiled, slow, like a contract being read from the back page forward. 500 billion, she said. 25%, preferred stock, prioritize dividends, and I want a seat at the quarterly review. The term sheet was clean. She had actually read the structure. Preferred stock with no operational voting meant Zane kept command. The dividend yield gave her a reason to want us to succeed, and I kept the budget pen. It was the first negotiation in this world where the other side understood what they were buying. I signed. The job fair drew 3,000 applicants. Monsters of every species lined up in the castle square, filling the roped-off lanes Gant had set up since dawn. The competition ratio was 300 to 1. I was hiring 10. The afternoon was running smoothly until the ancient fire dragon landed on the courtyard wall and demanded 500 billion mana in protection money. Volcanoes was old enough that his scales had gone from red to black, and large enough that his shadow covered the entire square. The crowd scattered. Zane rushed out and tried diplomacy, which lasted about 4 seconds before the dragon's growl shook the banners off their poles. I stepped forward with a chart. The dragon wanted gold. I asked him where he kept it. In a cave, on a pile, where he slept. I showed him the inflation data. Gold's purchasing power had halved in 15 years. His hoard was shrinking while he napped on it. He stopped growling. I offered preferred stock in Demon Holdings. Projected growth, 3 times the current value within a decade. Compounding dividends. And a magma spa built on company grounds, maintained at his preferred temperature as a signing benefit. He grabbed the contract pen in a claw the size of a desk and signed before I finished explaining the vesting schedule. Outside director and strategic asset. The second anchor shareholder, recruited from an extortion attempt. I made a note. The cap table now included a vampire aristocrat and an ancient dragon, which was either the strongest investor base in the world or the setup for the worst board meeting in history. In a corridor of the castle I had not visited yet, a girl in a cleaning uniform was mopping the floor of a Demon Holdings subsidiary office. She worked quietly, efficiently, with the kind of focus that suggested she was used to harder jobs. The name on her contract read Mina. She did not know who owned the company she worked for. She did not need to. The pay was good, the hours were fair, and the lunch was better than anything she had eaten in weeks. Across town, Alvin sat on a crate in an alley, reading a recruitment flyer he had picked up from the ground. He was out on bail, funded by a loan from the kind of people who charged interest the way weather charged coastlines. His hero title was gone. The legitimate hiring pool would not touch him. He had spent the morning doing herb gathering quests and running from slimes. The flyer was purple. The company was called Necro Staff. The tagline promised immediate hiring, no experience required. He walked in for the interview. They gave him a contract. He signed it without reading the fine print because he had never read the fine print on anything in his life, and that particular habit had already cost him a holy sword, a mansion, and an entire career. Somewhere behind a desk, a pen scratched an eternal clause into the binding, and the trap closed around the only person in the world who still thought he was too important to check the paperwork. The data told a story I had read before: 24-hour shifts, 0 overtime pay, 0 turnover because the dead cannot quit. Necro Staff Co. had solved the oldest problem in management by removing the one variable that makes employees expensive: the option to leave. I pulled up the asset depreciation curve. Their workers were running at 5% efficiency. That was not a company. That was a write-down. Zane stared at the projections. His eyes had gone from warm to red. He said nothing for a long time, then told me he wanted that company destroyed. Economically, legally, and personally. All three. I told him I had already prepared the paperwork. Alice caught the signal from the tracking spell I had planted on the recruitment flyer. The one Alvin had picked up outside the job fair. The one he had signed without reading. She pinpointed the source to a hidden facility beneath a mine on the eastern ridge. I made a note to invoice Alvin for the tracking costs later. He would not be able to pay, but the principle mattered. Gant loaded his gear. Zane drew the demon sword from its mount and put on full plate armor for the first time since I had started working here. The top 3 of the company, plus one very large security chief, marched out the front gate in formation. It was a going concern for about another hour. The iron door lasted 1 hit. Inside, the undead workers shuffled between conveyor belts in silence. Skeletons sorted ore. Zombies hauled crates. None of them looked up. They had been doing this for so long that the arrival of the Demon King in full armor did not register as unusual. Nothing registered as unusual when your contract said you worked forever. Necros came out of his back office screaming about trespassing and lawsuits. He was a lich in a cheap suit, staff in one hand, pointing at us with the other. I let him finish. Then I sat him down. I showed him his own balance sheet. Liabilities exceeded assets at fair value. His workforce was depreciating faster than his revenue could cover maintenance costs. His contracts relied on regulatory gray zones that I had spent the previous evening citing, clause by clause, into a formal filing. Every predatory eternal binding provision in his employment agreements violated 3 separate articles of the Demon Labor Code once you read them in the order I had arranged. He summoned golems. Zane raised one hand, and the golems ceased to exist. The facility shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. Necros looked at the empty space where his defense had been and understood the math. He signed the company over for 1 mana. I announced the new terms to the workers: 2 days off per week, paid leave, regular magic supply for maintenance. They would be transferred to Demon Holdings as the Undead Department, effective immediately, under at-will employment contracts that voided every eternal binding clause Necros had ever written. The first skeleton to understand what I had said stopped moving. Then he started crying. The tears came from empty sockets, which should have been impossible, but grief does not care about anatomy. I scanned the worker roster and found Alvin's name near the bottom, contracted to the company's mining division. I ran a quick appraisal: no holy sword, depleted magic reserves, outstanding debt in 6 figures. His unique mana purity trait had no recognized market valuation yet, which meant I could not price him as an asset. He was a non-reusable asset. I noted this in the log and moved on. Alvin saw me leaving. He called my name. I did not stop. Back at the castle, I turned the death traps into revenue. The spike pit on the first floor became a water slide with a 360-degree loop. The execution corridor's swinging iron balls became a bonus stage teleporter that dropped adventurers into a casino room where the house odds were carefully managed. The throne room became a premium item shop staffed by a succubus in company uniform, selling overpriced potions and gacha tickets. The old model killed adventurers and looted their pockets. Average take per visitor, 500 mana. Survival rate, 5%. Repeat customers, 0, because the dead do not come back for seconds. The new model entertained them. Average take per visitor, 50,000 mana. Survival rate, 100%. Repeat rate, 80%. The adventurers walked out smiling, broke, and already planning their next visit. The skeleton employees ran the gift shop in matching Aloha shirts. They were the Necro staff workers, relocated, rested, and for the first time in decades, wearing something other than rags. One of them asked me if the Aloha shirts were mandatory. I told him they were optional, but strongly encouraged for customer-facing roles. He put his on with both hands and smoothed the collar like it was made of silk. It was a write-down. Everything about his old life was a write-down, and the shirt was the first entry on the new ledger. The attendance logs told me what I should have expected. 0 paid leave taken. 120 hours of overtime per month. The undead department was working itself back into the ground because they did not believe rest was real. I found them in the cemetery dormitory, secretly working on their day off, hauling crates, sorting inventory, pretending to be busy because in Nacris's company, idle hands meant terminated contracts. I told them to stop. They flinched. One zombie asked if they were being let go. I showed them the performance graph. Fatigue was costing the department 80% of its output. Rest was not kindness. Rest was maintenance. If they wanted to be valuable, they needed to be functional, and functional meant days off. They listened. They did not believe me, but they listened. Then one of the older workers, a skeleton who had been with Necro staff for longer than anyone could remember, asked if paid leave meant he could go somewhere. I said yes. He asked if he could go home. I asked where home was. He said he had not seen his mother's grave in 200 years. She had died while he was still alive, and by the time Necris had finished with him, the contract had outlasted every person who remembered where she was buried. But he remembered. He had always remembered. I approved the leave request on the spot. 3 days. Travel expenses covered under the employee welfare budget. He stood there for a long time, holding the approval slip in both hands, and the bones in his fingers rattled because he could not stop shaking. He said thank you, but the words came out so quietly I almost missed them. I made a note to expand the paid leave policy. The Abyss market smelled like sulfur and bad decisions. Alice and I went in disguised. I wore a black coat and dark glasses. She wore a hooded outfit that made her look like an assassin from a budget stage play. Gant trailed us at a distance, looking like exactly the kind of person nobody wanted to start a conversation with. The market operated in a dimensional rift beneath the border territories. Goblins screamed about futures contracts. Orcs argued over derivative spreads. A magical price board on the far wall showed numbers that flickered and jumped with every transaction, and none of those numbers were honest. The reason we were here was brand damage. Someone had been selling Demon King's army guaranteed bonds on the open floor, rated AAA, promising 30% annual yield. I used analysis magic on one. Inside the packaging was a collateralized debt obligation stuffed with zombie guild debts, missing person loans, and goblin IOUs that would never clear. The bond was worth exactly 0. We found the hobgoblin merchant who had been pushing them. Gold teeth, rehearsed pitch, the kind of salesman who believed his own brochure. He offered me the bonds at a special rate for first-time buyers. I activated the audit circle. His asset values dropped to 0 in real time, displayed on the board for everyone to see. He paid full fraud compensation before his knees hit the ground. But the bonds were not the worst thing in his inventory. Alice pulled up the contract structure on a product called the Slime Bond. It looked like a standard adventurer debt derivative until you read the hedge clause. The insurance writer paid out more when the debtor died than when they survived. The product was designed so that investors profited from adventurer deaths. It was a death pool. I had seen versions of this in textbooks, but never one this clean. Someone had built it to work. Armed thugs arrived before I could trace the manufacturer. A one-eyed orc with a giant axe told me I was on his boss's floor and that tribute was due. Alice's hand went to her weapon. I stopped her. I held up my business card and told the orc that if anyone touched me, their employer's entire asset portfolio would be zeroed before the axe finished its swing. Then I snapped my fingers, and the market's price board glitched. Every number scrambled for half a second, then reset. The thugs looked at the board. They looked at me. They left. Greed came out of his back office, wearing every piece of jewelry he owned, which was a lot of jewelry and not a lot of solvency. He was fat, loud, and believed his own price board. He ordered his guards to kill me. I pointed at the floor beneath their boots and suggested they check their employer's financial status before committing to the assignment. Alice hacked the board. I snapped the audit open. Greed's hidden back account books filled the air between us in glowing columns. Assets, 1 million mana, mostly bad debt. Liabilities, 50 million mana. The man was insolvent and had been for years. The only thing holding his empire together was a number on a board that nobody had ever verified. The guards read the numbers, 50 million in debt. Their paychecks suddenly felt theoretical. Greed grabbed for his legendary sword. He pulled it from its case, like a man pulling a life raft from a sinking ship. He told the room the sword was worth enough to buy a country. I told Alice to show him reality. She activated the truth light. Fair value accounting, forced. The sword's gold leaf peeled away. The gemstones cracked and fell. The blade underneath was rusted scrap with no magical signature. Original book value, 100 million mana. Current fair value, 3 mana. Scrap metal rate. Greed watched his sword become a piece of garbage in his hands. The number on the price board updated. The guards saw it. I asked them if they thought their employer could cover this month's payroll. Nobody answered, which was an answer. The bank run started the way they always do. One investor checked his balance, then another, then the floor. They rushed the counters. They demanded cash. The price board numbers were falling faster than the merchants could process withdrawals, and every number that fell made the next withdrawal more urgent. Classical feedback loop. I had seen it in textbooks. It was uglier in person. Greed's mercenaries confronted him about unpaid wages. He promised double. The mercenary captain checked his crystal plate and found an empty account where his salary should have been. I terminated their employment contracts on the spot, citing non-payment, and displayed the filing on the overhead board for the entire floor to see. The mercenaries took their severance in jewelry. They stripped Greed down to his last accessory, and the crowd did the rest. Alice said that economics might be scarier than magic. I told her that magic had rules. Economics had suggestions. The market burned. We let it. When the fires died down, we walked through what was left. Alice hacked the market's data systems, customer lists, teleport gate coordinates, secret ledgers, supplier contracts, all extracted at zero cost because there was nobody left to charge. I registered a shell company called Demon Asset Management and filed the acquisition paperwork for the market's infrastructure. A ruined market bought at scrap price was still a market, and markets have value when you know how to rebuild them. Then Alvin crawled out of the rubble. He was thinner than the last time I had seen him, which was 2 days ago, which meant he had not eaten since Necros. He said he would do anything. He said he would sell anything. He said he had no pride left. I ran the appraisal again, non-reusable. His mana purity trait still had no recognized valuation, and until someone built a framework for pricing it, he was industrial waste by every metric I could measure. I pointed out that the debt-collecting orcs, drawn by his outstanding balances, were already gathering at the edge of the ruins. I suggested he use whatever combat skills he still had. Then, Alice opened the teleport gate, and we left. Behind us, Alvin screamed my name into the empty market. I sat in my office with coffee and a clean balance sheet. Necro staff acquired, Abyss Market acquired, Greed bankrupt, Undead Department operational, and on paid leave. The company's war fund had a new floor, and the floor was solid. That feeling lasted about 4 minutes. The alarm hit the castle like a physical thing. Red light, screaming crystals. Every monitoring sigil in the building went active at once. Zane burst through the door in his robe, sword drawn, asking if it was an attack. It was not an attack. It was worse. I pulled up the mana price index on the projection wall. The line was vertical, not steep. Vertical. Mana prices had spiked five-fold overnight. The Ironwall realm had cut all mana exports. I stared at the graph. Zane stared at the graph. The graph did not care about either of us. Supply shock. The kind that turns a profitable quarter into a survival exercise. The kind that makes every asset on your balance sheet worth less by morning, and every liability worth more. The castle's geothermal reserves would cover operations for maybe 6 weeks at current consumption. After that, the lights went out. After the lights went out, every contract I had signed, every department I had built, every employee I had promised paid leave became a line item with no funding. The coffee was still warm. I put it down. This was not a write-down. This was a war, not swords and magic. A resource war. The kind that does not end when someone surrenders because the supply chain does not care about flags. I pulled out a blank sheet and started writing. 5 degrees. My breath came out in thin white threads that hung in the air like they were waiting for someone to file them. I had set the thermostat myself. The heating gems we relied on ran through the magic stone chamber, and the magic stone chamber ran on imports from Ironwall. 3 days ago, Ironwall had shut off its mana exports without warning. The price of a single heating gem had jumped from 100 mana to 500 overnight. Bakeries were closing. Blacksmiths were cold forging because they could not afford to light their furnaces. The economy was entering a pattern I recognized. Prices climbing while income fell. Stagflation, the textbook kind, with a resource choke point someone had engineered on purpose. Zane burst through the office door, wrapped in a fur blanket, shivering hard enough to rattle the hinges. He demanded I turn the heat up. I handed him a paper fan I had folded from last quarter's cost report and told him to generate his own warmth. He stared at the fan, then at me, then at the frost on the windowsill. I showed him the supply graph, the vertical spike in import costs, the projected timeline for when the castle's heating reserves would run dry. 48 hours at current consumption, 72 if we rationed. He wanted to march east and take the resources by force. I told him war with Ironwall would cost more than the stones were worth, and the stones would stop existing the moment their minds heard the word invasion. He wanted to summon a second sun. I told him the agricultural sector would collapse from crop overheating inside a week, and the paper fan hit his wrist before he could finish the sentence. There is a ley line node under this castle, I said. It has been here since before the castle was built. Nobody has tapped it because the magic stone chamber has spent centuries lobbying to suppress any alternative energy research that would threaten their monopoly. He asked what I needed. 48 hours. Alice and the engineers we inherited from the black market operation, and your personal guarantee that when the magic stone chamber sends their elders to complain, you will not let them pass the front gate. He agreed before I finished, told me to crush whatever cartel stood in the way, then went back to shivering. I made a note that the Demon King's thermoregulation was a liability I should probably budget around. The cavern was the size of a cathedral, and Alice had turned it into one. The ley line tap ran through the bedrock in a bore shaft that went deeper than the castle's foundations, channeling the planet's internal mana circulation up through crystal conduits the black market engineers had assembled in 2 sleepless days. The air tasted like ozone after rain. The hum was low and steady, like a heartbeat the building had been missing its entire life. Alice stood at the control platform, her fingers still on the console, and told me the numbers. 5 mana per unit, maintenance only. The imported magic stones had been costing us 500 per unit, and that was before the spike. The ratio was clean, 100 times cheaper. Zane pressed his hand to one of the conduits and stood there with his eyes closed for a long time. When he opened them, he was grinning. He said the mana was warm and pure, and he wanted to open the gates and distribute it to every citizen in the territory immediately. I told him we would, but not through the chamber's distribution network, which they would shut down the moment they realized what we had built. The black market teleport network I had salvaged from the Greed acquisition was already mapped to every population center in Demon territory. Alice had reconfigured it from a smuggling grid into a direct distribution channel overnight. Energy from the ley line plant, routed through the teleport nodes, delivered to households at cost. No middleman, no markup, no chamber. We powered the grid on. On the monitoring screens, a mother warmed milk for her baby on a magic stove that had been cold for 3 days. A baker relit his furnace and wept. Citizens lined the streets, thanking the castle by name. The magic stone chamber elders elders arrived within the hour. There were 6 of them, old demons in expensive robes, and they spoke like men who had never been told no. They denounced the geothermal plant as unstable, untested, dangerous. They insisted that cheap energy would destroy market order. They demanded the project be halted. I let them finish. Then I showed them their own warehouses. The magic stone chamber had been hoarding stones since the moment Ironwall cut supply. They had bought cheap, held stock while prices spiked, and planned to sell back to the citizens they were pretending to protect at a 500% markup. The receipts were in their own filing system. I had accessed it the previous night. I froze their assets, antitrust violations, price-fixing collusion, and humanitarian charges for profiteering during a supply crisis. Their balance screens went to 0 while they watched. One of them tried to argue. Zane stood up from the throne. The elder stopped talking. The chamber's monopoly was dead, not broken gradually, not negotiated away, dead. In the time it took Alice to refresh the distribution dashboard, every household in demon territory had switched to geothermal supply, and the chamber's entire business model became a historical footnote. That afternoon, a letter arrived from the undead department. One of the skeleton workers had written to thank us for the cheap heating at the old cemetery dormitory. He said it was the first time in 200 years the graves had been warm enough to sit by comfortably. He included a drawing of himself sitting next to a headstone with a small magic heater beside it. The drawing was terrible. It was the best piece of mail I had ever received. I set it on my desk and did not comment on it. The intelligence report that arrived an hour later was a different matter. Ironwall's army had mobilized. 30,000 soldiers, heavy armor, Archmage Corps. The embargo had failed. They were coming with force. It was a negative externality. They just did not know it yet. I felt it before I saw it. A pressure in the air, like the atmosphere had thickened and turned sour. The grass on the plain below the walls was browning in a wave that moved faster than the army behind it. Birds dropped out of the sky in mid-flight and did not get back up. The Ironwall archmages stood at the front of the formation, chanting. The spell they were building was black and viscous, clinging to the air in sheets that smelled like sulfur and dead soil. The fireballs they launched hit Zane's barriers and pushed them back. The Demon King dug his feet into the stone and held, but his expression had changed. Alice ran the numbers on her console and told me what I had already guessed. The enemy mages were burning almost nothing. Their private cost for the spell was functionally 0. 0 cost, infinite output. The kind of equation that does not exist in any honest system. I put on my audit glasses and looked again. The hidden cost was everywhere. The spell was not free. It was consuming the life force of the environment itself. Trees, soil, insects, the ambient mana field, the spirits that lived in the grass. Every joule of energy the archmages were throwing at us was being extracted from the shared resource base of the entire region, and the bill was being pushed onto every living thing within several kilometers. It is the textbook definition of a negative externality, I said. The cost of the spell is real. It is enormous. It is simply not being paid by the people casting it. It is being paid by the land, the air, and everything alive between here and the horizon. Zane wanted to charge them. I told him to wait. The math was clean. Voidfire was a spell that imposed its cost on everyone except the caster. If the global framework I had been building since the incorporation could identify who was bearing that cost, it could bill the responsible party. That was what a tax system was for, not punishment, correct pricing. I had spent my career reading balance sheets that lied about where the cost went. A merchant who dumped waste into a river was not paying for clean water. An employer who overworked his staff until they collapsed was not paying for the years he stole. Every system I had ever audited had the same structural flaw. The people who caused the damage were never the people who received the bill. The entire profession of accounting existed because the world could not be trusted to price its own behavior. Voidfire was the purest version of that lie I had ever seen. 0 cost to the caster, infinite cost to the world, and nobody had ever built a system that could make the caster pay. I reached into my coat and pulled out the red contract, the system startup key for causal taxation. I had been carrying it since the incorporation. I had hoped I would never need to use it at military scale. Alice, bring the collection system online, she typed. The console flared. Ready, she said, worldwide. The grid went live. Red lines spread across the plane in a lattice that covered the ground, the air, and the space between the archmages and the castle walls. Every square meter of the battlefield was now inside the causal taxation perimeter. The Iron Wall general laughed. He shouted something about the futility of light shows. He ordered the archmages to fire. They fired. The void fire spell completed. The air around the casters thinned. The system identified the negative externality in real time. Total environmental cost, 20 billion mana. Pollution coefficient, infinite. The framework applied the punitive rate, 15,000%. A payment window materialized in front of every mage on the field. Environmental load tax, amount due, 20 billion mana. Payment method, immediate. They could not pay. Nobody could pay that number. The system moved to the next available asset class, the caster's own magical reserves. Collection began. I watched through the audit glasses. The mana flow reversed direction. Every thread of stolen energy that had been draining outward from the land snapped backward toward its source, following the tax framework's logic to the letter. The system did not care about rank, about armor, about how many wars these mages had won. It cared about one thing. Someone owed a debt, and the debt would be collected. The archmages' staves went dark. Their chanting cut off mid-syllable. The spell they had built, the black viscous fire that had been eating the land alive, reversed course. It pulled back into the casters like water draining through a crack in the floor. The mana in their bodies, the reserves that made them mages, the capacity that defined their entire military value, all of it was seized as collateral against the unpaid tax debt. They collapsed, one by one, like puppets whose strings had been cut at the same instant. 1,500 archmages hit the ground in silence. Their staves rolled away. Their armor suddenly looked too heavy for the bodies inside it. They were alive. They were breathing. But every trace of magic that had ever run through them was gone, extracted as payment for the cost they had tried to push onto the world. The void fire died. The air thickened again. The sickly haze cleared, and the afternoon sun came back clean and hard. The dying grass at the caster's feet did not regrow, but it stopped getting worse. The system's completion log read, deficit collected, environmental surplus allocated, status balanced. The Iron Wall infantry stood frozen. Without their archmages, they had no siege capability, no offensive magic, no way to take a fortified position held by the Demon King himself. Their general stared at the bodies of his mage corps and said nothing for a very long time. Gant lowered his shield. He had not used it once. He told me politely that he felt his role had been rendered redundant. Cost reduction, I said. If your shield broke, the repair bill would come out of the security budget. He accepted this with the expression of a man who understood the logic but did not enjoy it. The Iron Wall army retreated. They left their archmages on the field because the archmages could not walk. A medical detail would come for them later. They would live. They would eat and breathe and grow old and tell their grandchildren about the day the sky turned red. They would never cast again, but they would live. The math was clean. The resource king of Ironwall came in person. He came through the front gate without his army, without his mages, with a single ceremonial ring on his finger and the expression of a man who had already lost but had not admitted it yet. He tried one last thing, a concealed attack spell in the ring, aimed at Zane. The Demon King caught the blast with one open palm, then drove his fist into the floor 6 inches from the king's face. The stone cracked in a web that ran to the walls. The Resource King fell backward and did not get up. Zane told him, calmly, that he could reduce the entire nation of Ironwall to rubble with a single gesture, and that the only reason it still existed was that his CFO had suggested a more profitable alternative. I dropped the treaty on the floor in front of him. 300 pages, the global cap and trade agreement for mana emissions. Every nation assigned a mana usage cap based on territorial size, population, and economic output. Nations that exceeded their cap would purchase emission permits from Demon Holdings at market rate. Nations that fell under cap could sell their surplus. The entire system regulated by Demon Holdings' causal taxation framework. I showed him the chart, the emission caps by country. Iron Walls was the lowest on the board. Demon Holdings was the highest. He protested. He said Iron Wall was a proud resource nation, that it would never bow to a demon army's economic framework. I told him the alternative. His mages were broken. His army had no offensive capability. His nation's entire economy depended on exporting resources to countries that now had a cheaper domestic alternative. If he refused to sign, Iron Wall would be economically isolated within a fiscal quarter. If he signed, his nation could participate in the global mana market under rules that would keep it viable. The contract included an automatic enforcement clause, causal taxation, embedded at the treaty level. Any nation that violated its cap would have the excess cost collected directly from its citizens' mana reserves, the same mechanism that had ended the battle outside the walls. He signed. I watched his pen move across the signature line, a king's hand trained to sign decrees and declarations of war, reduced to ratifying a regulatory framework written by a former accountant who had been fired by a hero. There was a symmetry to it that I appreciated more than I should have. His hand shook the entire time, but the signature was legible. The contract sealed itself with a binding glow, and the resource king of Ironwall became the first foreign head of state to voluntarily enter a regulatory framework administered by Demon Holdings. I filed the treaty. Gant escorted the king out. Zane sat back on the throne and asked me if I was satisfied. The margins are acceptable, I said. I walked through the energy department on my way to the balcony and found Alvin at the intake desk. He was filling out paperwork, standard onboarding forms. His handwriting was terrible, but he was trying, which was more than he had done in 3 years as the hero. The contract had been drawn up that morning. Mana Purity Specialist, Energy Department, Demon Holdings Comradio Labudao salary, benefits, 2 days off per week, paid leave, dental. The same package the undead workers received, because I did not believe in tiered benefit structures for operational staff. Alvin had signed without reading a single clause. He had looked at the words salary and paid leave, and his pen had moved before his brain caught up. The hero who had fired me was now my contractor, and he had not even negotiated. I stood there for a moment and watched him struggle with the emergency contact field. He did not have one. He wrote none in a hand that pressed too hard on the paper. The thing about Alvin was that he had always been valuable, not the way he thought, not the golden armor, not the holy sword, not the S-rank classification that was subsidized by equipment I had leased on his behalf. His actual asset was his mana purity. Alice had found it when she cracked the goblin timer back in the early days. His body processed mana at a purity rate that no machine could match. Every enchantment that had ever worked on him worked because the mana running through his system was clean enough to power it without loss. Nobody had ever told him. Nobody had ever priced it. He had spent his career believing he was special because of a sword that was not his. And now the sword was gone and the purity remained, and the system was finally valuing him at what he was actually worth. Not a hero, not a failure, an employee with a rare skill set and a compensation package that reflected it. 3 years ago, I had sat at a desk just like that one, filing his paperwork, leasing his equipment, managing his subscriptions, and he had not once asked my name. Now, he was sitting at my desk, in my department, filling out my forms, and he still did not understand what had changed. That was fine. Understanding was not in his contract. He looked up as I passed. I did not stop. The city was alive. The wind on the balcony smelled like forge smoke and fresh bread, which was the exact opposite of what it had smelled like a week ago. A week ago, it had smelled like nothing, because nobody could afford to burn anything. Every building had light. The streets were full. The bakeries were open. The forges were running. And from somewhere below the castle walls, I could hear music that had not been there a week ago. The geothermal grid had done in 48 hours what 3 years of conventional policy had never managed. It had given the territory an economy that did not depend on anyone else's supply chain. Zane stood beside me on the balcony, his armor still on, his cape moving in the evening wind. He said something about how the country looked good from up here. He thanked me. He used my full name, which he only did when he meant it. I opened the recording crystal and began dictating the post-treaty financial report. Sales had increased from 50 to 5,000 in units of 100 million mana. Operating profit had swung from -20 to +4,200. net profit $3,800. The geothermal plant's cost basis was negligible and would amortize inside 2 quarters. The new asset categories came next: the cap-and-trade revenue stream, the emission permit market, the causal taxation framework, now treaty embedded at international scale, the Iron Wall Treaty itself, which was not just a peace agreement but a recurring revenue contract with automatic enforcement. I paused. The recording crystal waited. Somewhere in the lower levels, the castle's emergency power backup systems hummed along their ancient circuits. Most of them were mundane. One of them was not. There was a dormant structure in the old war wing, buried under 3 centuries of dust, listed in the castle's original inventory as floating fortress, built for world destruction, currently offline. I had flagged it in the infrastructure audit. It was not relevant yet. I made a note. The city lights stretched to the edge of the territory, and beyond them, the dark mass of the continent waited. The Holy Kingdom of Elysian was out there, the largest economy in the world that had not yet signed a treaty with Demon Holdings. Their market was wide open. Their regulatory framework was a century out of date, and their books, from what the intelligence division had intercepted, were a disaster. "Cliff," Zane said, watching the lights, "you have built a good country." I closed the recording. The crystal dimmed. The financial report was clean. The margins were acceptable, and the next market was already on the calendar. "It is not a country," I said. "It is a company, and we are not done." The Holy Kingdom of Elysian was the whitest place I had ever seen. White walls, white streets, white cathedral rising like a tooth from the center of the capital. Even the citizens wore white, with little gold pendants bouncing at their collars as they walked. The air smelled like incense and compliance. Alice pulled her hood lower and muttered that the brightness was giving her a migraine. Gant kept his hand near his belt, where his shield usually sat, and said nothing. We were here on market research, a new territory, a new regulatory environment, a fresh audit target. The cap-and-trade treaty I had signed with Ironwall gave Demon Holdings cross-jurisdictional standing in every signatory state, and Elysian was a signatory. That was the theory. On the cathedral balcony, a girl with golden hair stood behind a railing, waving a slender wand. Golden particles drifted down over the crowd like slow-motion confetti, and the crowd wept. They called it the saint's miracle. Mothers lifted their children toward the light. Old men dropped to their knees in the street. I activated my audit and pointed it at the balcony. High-concentration potion mist, aerosolized through a nozzle hidden behind the railing, illuminated with a basic light enhancement spell. The cost per display was probably 400 mana. The crowd was donating 10,000 per session. The audit bounced. Error code 999. Religious black box. My skill had been repelled not by a magical barrier, but by a legal exemption. The kingdom's commercial law carved out a hole for anything filed under religious activity, and the saint's operation sat inside it like a tax shelter with stained glass windows. Before I could recalculate, 2 figures appeared on the balcony beside the saint. One was the Pope, an old man in layered vestments holding a staff. The other was younger, in a disheveled white suit with silver accessories and a thin smoking implement trailing something that smelled like artificial blueberry. The Pope raised his staff. His voice came through amplification speakers mounted on every building in the plaza. He declared that heretics who defiled divine blessings with numbers had entered the holy capital. The crowd turned. I reached for my emergency escape note, a sealed mana bill designed for exactly this kind of jurisdictional trap. It crumbled in my hand. The asset freeze had already hit. The man in the white suit spoke then, his voice carrying across the square with the satisfied cadence of someone who had rehearsed. He said the Holy Kingdom had enacted a complete economic blockade against Demon Holdings. Every asset we held in Human Kingdom jurisdictions was frozen pending a religious court review. Cross-border payment networks severed. Accounts locked. He used a term I had not heard in this world before. He called it an exclusion from the international settlement system. I noted the phrasing. Stones hit Gant's back. The crowd was closing in from 3 sides, their faces twisted with the particular righteous fury that comes from believing the person in front of you has been pre-condemned by the highest authority they know. Alice's tablet was dead. My financial tools were locked. We had nothing but Gant. Gant was enough. He lowered his shoulder and drove forward through the line of guards like a man who had spent his entire career learning how to make a door where there was not one. 3 guards went sideways. A 4th tried to grab his arm and discovered that an S-rank defense captain does not stop for jurisdictional objections. We ran. The cathedral bells were ringing behind us. The crowd's shouts folded into one long sound, and the man on the balcony was laughing, and Elysian's bright white streets went dark as we dropped into the alleys below the main avenue, cold. The alleys behind the Holy Capital's main avenue were nothing like the marble front, cracked stone, frost on everything. The buildings leaned inward and blocked whatever light the city had left to offer. We tried 3 inns. The first one looked at Gant's face, recognized the Demon Holdings emblem still stitched to his collar, and shut the door before we finished speaking. The second accepted a high-purity mana stone as payment, examined it, and handed it back. Secondary sanctions. Anyone caught sheltering heretics faced their own asset freeze. The stone was clean and valuable and completely useless because it had touched my hand. Alice approached a bread stall. The owner called the guards. We left before they arrived. I took off my jacket and handed it to Alice. She told me I would get sick. I told her the CTO's health was the company's highest priority loss risk and that the jacket was asset preservation. She held it for a moment, then put it on and said nothing else. Her ears were flat under the hood. Gant found a rusted manhole cover in a garbage pile and tested its weight. He said he did not need a mithril shield to protect us, and that scrap iron would do. He set it against his shoulder and it fit like it had been waiting for him. We settled against a wall in a garbage dump where the smell was bad enough that nobody else would come. The frost was thickening. Alice's breath came in short white bursts. Gant's torn shirt was not enough. I reached into my coat and pulled out a single bill. 10 billion mana, the highest denomination printed by any treasury in the world. My name was on the frozen asset list, which meant the bill's transactional value in Elysian was exactly 0, but it was still paper. Paper printed with mana-infused ink and mana-infused ink burns. I struck a match and held it to the corner. The bill caught slowly, then flared into a pale blue-white flame that threw our shadows against the alley wall. 10 billion mana, rendered down to its only remaining utility, warmth. Alice stared at the fire. Gant stared at me. Here, I said. This is the most meaningful use for it. The mana in the ink released heat as it dissipated, and for a few minutes, we sat in the gutter of the holiest city in the world, warming our hands over the ashes of a fortune. Alice asked very quietly what we were going to do. She said her tablet was disconnected from the network. She could not hack. She could not audit. She was just useless. I told her she was not useless. She was disconnected. Those were different problems with different solutions. A religious state this size did not survive on faith alone. The spectacle on the cathedral balcony cost money. The golden particles cost money. The amplification system, the white marble, the incense piped through the streets, the guards who threw stones on command. There was a revenue source underneath this city's piety, and it was not the offering plate. Religious economies always had a shadow side, a place where the rules did not apply, a place that ran on probability instead of prayer. I told Alice and Gant we were going to the underground casino. Gant picked up his manhole cover. Alice pulled my jacket tighter. I watched the last of the 10 billion mana bill curl into ash, and I made a note of what it had cost me. Nothing I was not already planning to collect back with interest. I was not there for this. What I am about to describe I pieced together later from system logs, security footage stored on the local backup drive, and the resignation letter Mina left on the warden's desk. The letter was 3 sentences long and ended with a smiley face. Back at the castle, the blackout hit within hours of our excommunication. The Holy Kingdom's economic blockade did not just freeze our overseas accounts, it froze the cross-jurisdictional payment rails that backstopped our operating cash. The geothermal plant ran fine on local power, but every external account that funded payroll, supply contracts, and security automation was locked on the other side of a religious court injunction. The castle went dark. Zane raged in the throne room, demanding to know why the elevators had stopped and why nobody could explain it without using the word jurisdiction. A general informed him that the CFO was under economic sanctions in Elysian and that the central bank accounts were inaccessible. Zane asked how a man who controlled a 5 trillion mana company could be locked out of his own building by a country that ran on incense. Nobody had a good answer. Emergency backup power activated. The system displayed a countdown: 8 days, 192 hours of reserve energy before permanent shutdown. The fallback chain listed every emergency asset the castle had, including, on the third page, a line item I would not fully appreciate until much later. One dormant floating fortress, original purpose listed as world destruction, current status offline, estimated reactivation cost prohibitive. I noted that too when I finally read the log, filed it away, kept reading. The prison cells ran on the same financial system feed as the rest of the castle's security grid. When the payment rails froze, the electronic locks failed open. Most prisoners stayed in their cells because they had nowhere to go. Mina was not most prisoners. She had been a model detainee for 3 phases, mopping floors, answering politely, never once testing the boundaries. The warden had moved her to a lower security wing 2 weeks earlier because she had not caused a single incident. When the lights went out, she was the first person through her cell door. I reconstructed what happened next from the security backup. Mina moved through the darkened corridors to the energy department, found Alvin at his contracted station, and terminated his employment agreement. She used the early exit clause I had written into his contract myself, the one designed to protect him in case of a catastrophic system failure. I had put that clause in because I believed no employee should be trapped by bad infrastructure. Mina used it because she needed Alvin mobile. She told him they were leaving, going to the Holy Kingdom. She said the castle was finished, that a company that could not pay its own electricity was not worth loyalty, and that his high-purity mana would make him valuable in Elysian's market. He asked about his daily work quota. She told him to forget it. They left through a service teleporter that was running on local battery. Mina walked ahead. Alvin followed. He always followed. The system logged the escape 40 seconds later and flagged it for urgent CFO review. The CFO was sitting in a garbage dump in Elysian, warming his hands over the remains of a 10 billion mana bill, and did not receive the notification. When I read the log days later, I felt exactly 2 things. The first was professional irritation that my own contract clause had been used against me. The second was something colder. Mina had not escaped because she was desperate. She had escaped because she had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening, and the fact that she had waited patiently for months meant she had known or guessed that one was coming. I made a note, filed her under threats. The Golden Rat was exactly the kind of place a holy city pretends does not exist. Below street level, oil lamps, smoke so thick the ceiling was invisible. A bouncer with a scar collection let us through after Gant showed him the manhole cover and said nothing. Gant had 50,000 holy coins in his pocket, earned by selling scrap metal from the garbage district over the past 6 hours. That was our entire liquid position. The company that controlled a 5 trillion mana balance sheet was entering a casino with pocket change and a repurposed sewer lid. I noted the irony. Then I got to work. Magic dampeners lined the walls. My audit skill was still frozen by the blockade, but even without the freeze, the dampeners would have killed it. Nobody used magic in the Golden Rat. That was the point. The house made its money on the assumption that without magic, gamblers were just gamblers. The assumption was wrong. Without magic, gamblers were physicists. I spent 20 minutes watching the roulette table before placing a bet. The table had a slight rightward tilt, not much, enough. The ball favored the lower quadrant on long spins, settling between 15 and 25 more often than pure randomness allowed. The dealer had a hand bias, a habitual flick that added consistent leftward spin, and there was a magnetic switch under the table that the dealer tapped with his knee when a high bet landed on an unfavorable number. Alice spotted the switch. I spotted the bias. Together, we mapped the wheel's real probability distribution in the time it took the table to run 3 rounds. Red 19, I said. I put all 50,000 holy coins on a single number. The dealer spun. The ball rattled, drifted, and landed. Red 19, 36 times payout, 1,800,000 holy coins. The table went quiet. I left the winnings on the table and pointed to the next number. Black 8. The dealer looked at the pit boss. The pit boss nodded. The dealer spun. The ball landed on Black 8, 64,800,000 holy coins. 2 bets, no magic, just a tilted table and a man who understood that physics does not care about jurisdiction. The pit boss sent 4 men with knives. Gant put his manhole cover between me and the first blade, caught the second man's wrist, and dropped the leader with a single strike from the flat of the iron disc. The remaining 2 reconsidered. I stepped over the unconscious thug leader and informed the dealer that we would be collecting our winnings in full. The dealer's hands were shaking. He pointed at the safe in the back wall and told us to take it and leave. Alice was already inside the casino's bookkeeping system. The Golden Rat kept its records on a local ledger, disconnected from the kingdom's main financial network for obvious reasons. But Alice did not need a network. She needed a ledger. The ownership trail ran through 3 shell entities, a dormant real estate trust, and a tax haven registration I recognized from the mapping she had been building since Phase 5. At the end of the trail was a name, Kane, the man on the balcony, the advisor with the blueberry smoke, and the rehearsed cadence and the word exclusion in his vocabulary. He owned this casino. He owned, by extension, the entire underground revenue stream that funded the Holy Capital's visible economy. The golden particles were paid for by roulette tables and backroom card games run by a man who smelled like artificial candy. I sat down at the pit boss's desk, pushed the unconscious bodies aside, and laid out 64,800,000 holy coins across the green felt. Alice, I said, mock up a logo. Use the manhole cover. She looked at me. Then she laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since the garbage dump. Demon Credit, an underground financial vehicle, registered nowhere, recognized by no court, backed by 64,800,000 holy coins in casino winnings, and the institutional knowledge of a CFO who had just been thrown into a gutter by a man who thought freezing accounts would stop an accountant. I wanted 2 things. I wanted to unfreeze my accounts and reverse the heretic branding. But that was small. What I actually wanted was to dismantle the economic system that had just locked me out. Not because it had locked me out, because the system was built by a man who used a term from a settlement network that should not exist in this world. And that meant he knew things he should not know. And that meant the game had just changed. I had entered Elysian as a market researcher. I was leaving the Golden Rat as a competitor. The monobill was ash. The manhole cover was a logo. Kane was a name on a ledger. And the casino's back room smelled like victory and cheap lamp oil. I noted the profit margin. It was acceptable. The warehouse smelled like mildew and rust, and the kind of ambition that only grows in rooms nobody is watching. Gant nailed a plank above the door and bolted the old manhole cover to it, like a coat of arms. Demon Credit was open for business. Alice had rigged a black market terminal on the desk overnight. She pulled the castle's server logs through a back channel and turned the screen toward me. The backup power read 7 days, 11 hours, 30 minutes. Alvin had disconnected. The main power feed was dead, and every hour we spent in this warehouse was an hour the castle ran on batteries. I stared at the countdown and did the math in my head. 7 days to break a kingdom's financial system, working out of a room that smelled like wet stone. I had worked with worse deadlines. I told her to keep the line open and to start mapping the kingdom's commercial paper market. She asked why. I told her we were not lending money. We were buying it. Gant looked confused. He reminded me our total capital was 64,800,000 holy coins. I adjusted my glasses and told him that was more than enough. Then I told him to hang the sign outside and start letting people in. The first customer arrived within the hour, a wholesaler in a decent coat and a terrible mood. He had a promissory note from a kingdom-backed buyer, 9 million holy coins, due in 6 months. He could not feed his employees with a piece of paper that said 6 months. He needed cash today. I offered him 450,000, 5% of face value. He stared at me like I had slapped him. I let the silence sit. He signed. By noon, the line stretched past the alley. Bakers, cloth merchants, lumber dealers, every one of them carrying a kingdom-backed note they could not convert to a single coin. Every one of them accepting 5 cents on the holy coin because 5 cents was better than nothing. Alice ran the tallies. By the end of the first day, Demon Credit held over 1,300,000,000 in face value claims against the Holy Kingdom's commercial base. I stepped outside and looked at the line. It wound past the alley and around the corner, out of sight. These people were not stupid. They were starving for liquidity in the wealthiest nation on the continent, and they could not understand why. The kingdom had gold in its vaults, or so they believed. It had a church that printed blessings. It had a AAA credit rating from every agency on the continent, and its merchants could not make payroll. I could see the reason they could not. Alice pulled up the kingdom's public broadcast channel on her terminal. A familiar voice was selling something. Cain stood on a glowing stage, arms wide, pitching a product he called Magic Holy Relics, digital certificates with unique serial numbers, blessed by the church, tradable among believers. He told the crowd they were buying heaven's priority boarding passes. The crowd was buying them with grocery money. I watched the numbers scroll. A relic that sold for 10,000 holy coins yesterday was trading at 500,000 today. Nobody was selling. Everybody was holding. The entire real economy's cash was being vacuumed into a speculative product that produced nothing, backed nothing, and existed only because people believed it would keep going up. A bubble, Alice said. I corrected her. A pump. The relics were the bait. The automatic 10% resale fee wired to Cain's account was the engine, and the cash-starved real economy was the victim. Cain was draining the kingdom's commercial base into his own pocket and replacing the missing liquidity with promissory notes the merchants could not cash. That was why every wholesaler in the capital was standing in my line. Alice pulled the fee structure apart on her terminal. Every time a relic changed hands, 10% of the sale price vanished into Cain's account. The buyers did not notice because the price kept climbing. They thought they were getting rich. They were funding Cain's operating costs and calling it a miracle. The bubble was the cause of the cash shortage. Cain was the issuer. And bubbles, by definition, pop. I told Alice to start mapping the kingdom's government bond market. We were going to borrow those bonds, sell them at the top, and buy them back at the bottom. The spread between the two prices would be our profit. She grinned. How much are we borrowing? Everything. The broadcast feed showed the cathedral's top floor. Cain had Mina and Alvin in front of him. Mina was crying. Her tears looked expensive. She told Cain they had escaped the demon army's cruelty, that she and Alvin needed protection, that they could serve as witnesses. Cain asked what profit that brought him. He said he was not a charity. He said the demon army would collapse on its own in a week anyway, so her information was already priced in. Mina stopped crying. The tears dried up so fast they might as well have been on a timer. She pitched a different angle. She proposed becoming a rival saint, a dark saint, a deliberately controversial figure to split the believers into factions and double the engagement. She laid out the math like she had rehearsed it. Faction wars meant more broadcasts. More broadcasts meant more relic purchases. More relic purchases meant more revenue. She smiled and said she could be the villain the audience loved to hate. Cain's expression changed. He looked at her the way a broker looks at a new derivative product. He agreed. Then he looked at Alvin. Alvin sat in a chair, barely upright, muttering about mana. Cain examined him and found what he wanted. Alvin's body was saturated with high-purity mana from his years on the castle's energy contract. Cain told Alvin he would be the centerpiece of the broadcast, a miracle performer, a sign of heaven's favor. He said the contract was simple. He lied about every term. The broadcast went live that evening. Mina wore black and taunted the crowd from the left platform. On the right, Celestia, the kingdom's actual saint, stood with a forced smile and a thin collar around her neck that I recognized as an obedience device. She did not look rescued. She looked like someone who had been performing on command for so long that the smile was the last muscle memory she had left. Between them, Alvin was strapped to a stage rig at the center. When the donations spiked, Cain's device drew on Alvin's mana, and the stage erupted in golden light. The crowd screamed with joy. Cain called it a miracle. Alvin's face said otherwise. I watched from the warehouse with a cup of cold coffee and the taste of iron in my mouth. Gant punched the desk. He called it unforgivable. Alice frowned and said Cain had no aesthetics. I agreed with both of them, but I did not say so. I said the broadcast had confirmed the trade. Cain was routing every holy coin of relic revenue into government bond purchases. He was inflating the bond market with manufactured demand. The higher he pushed the price, the more leverage we could extract on the short side. It was the cleanest setup I had ever seen, and the man running it did not even know he was building the instrument of his own destruction. I explained it once, for Gant. We borrow bonds from foreign banks. The banks lend them because the kingdom's bonds are rated AAA, and the banks believe they are safe. We sell those borrowed bonds immediately at the current inflated price. When the price crashes, we buy them back cheap and return them. The difference is profit. He asked me to say that again in words he could hit something with. I told him to imagine borrowing an apple worth 100 coins, selling it today, and buying it back tomorrow for 1 coin. 99 coins of profit. That was a short sale. Gant asked what happens if the price does not crash. I told him it would crash. The kingdom's central bank vault was empty. Cain had been funding the bubble by draining reserves that were never replenished. The moment the market found out, every bondholder on the continent would sell at once. Alice looked up from her terminal. Her fingers hovered over the keys. Ready when you are, I told her to execute. The Holy Maiden election ran through the night. Cain had turned the plaza into a coliseum of wallets. Believers voted by purchasing relics. Celestia stood on one side, exhausted. Her hands were trembling. From the cheap seats in the back of the square, I could see her face clearly enough. She looked like someone who had been performing miracles at gunpoint for years and had finally stopped pretending she was fine. Mina performed the dark saint role with full theatricality. Black dress, sharp tongue, taunting the crowd into fury. The believers loved it. They hated her and bought relics to prove it. The revenue counter on the broadcast screen climbed. Alvin glowed on his platform. Gold when Celestia's side donated. Rainbow when Mina's side donated. Cain's device pulled harder with every spike in revenue, and Alvin's body responded the only way it could. He screamed. The music swallowed it. The crowd saw light and called it blessing. I doubted anyone in the square could hear him over the hymns. I could not look away, and I could not watch. Back in the warehouse, Alice was dumping bonds. Billions of holy coins worth, sold in waves timed to the relic revenue spikes. She had borrowed against the structural claims Demon Credit held, the distressed promissory notes from every merchant in our line, and sold into the market at peak prices over a 12-hour window. The bond price held. Cain's relic revenue was absorbing every sell order we placed, pushing the price even higher. Every coin the believers spent on relics was being routed into bond purchases that propped up the very system we were betting against. Gant looked nervous. The screen showed prices climbing past our sell point. I told him to wait. The higher the price climbed, the more potential energy it stored. A ball at the top of a hill does not need to be pushed hard. It needs to be pushed once. I told Alice to confirm the vault. She had already run the hack through Demon Credit's domestic vehicle registration, which gave her backdoor access to the kingdom's commercial audit trail. The central bank's reserve balance read 0. Every coin was gone. Cain had collateralized the reserves and never put them back. I said one word: leak. Gant asked why we did not just hijack the broadcast directly and shout the truth. I told him that a heretic shouting, "The vault is empty," would be dismissed as demon propaganda before the echo faded. Believers do not trust the devil's testimony. They trust the newspaper. They trust the credit rating stamp. They trust the intelligence briefing from a neighboring kingdom that has no reason to lie. Alice sent the audit data to every financial outlet, credit rating agency, and intelligence bureau she could reach. She copied neighboring kingdoms. She copied the continental press. She hit send and gave a thumbs up. 10 minutes later, the border guard's terminals started screaming. Emergency alerts. Bond crash. Rating downgrade. The Continental Credit Agency dropped the Holy Kingdom's bonds from AAA to junk in a single bulletin. Foreign investors dumped their holdings. The domestic market followed. A believer in the cathedral square saw the foreign news on his terminal and shouted. The shout became a wave. The official broadcast cut to an emergency bulletin showing a photograph of the vault. Empty shelves. Dust. Nothing. Cain's voice came through the feed, screaming to cut the broadcast. Too late. The crowd had already turned. The chanting stopped. The relic counter on the broadcast screen froze, then dropped. Then the number kept falling until it looked like a countdown to nothing. The plaza became a stampede. Fathers who had spent their children's education funds on relics ran for the central bank. Merchants who had traded real goods for digital blessings ran behind them. Glass broke. Fires started. The cathedral's golden stage went dark. I watched the profit graph on Alice's terminal. The line climbed like it was trying to leave the screen. Gant stared at the number and asked me if the digits were correct. They were. 3 trillion mana. Our starting capital had been 1,300,000,000. I explained we had used 230 times leverage because the foreign bank system rated the bonds risk-free and approved the margin automatically. Gant asked who was on the other side of our trade, who lost 3 trillion mana so we could gain it. I told him Cain Kane was. His own bond buyback program had absorbed every sell order we placed during the bubble. He had been propping up the price with his own money, buying every bond we dumped. When the price crashed, the losses landed on the same account that had been buying to keep the price up. Kane had eaten his own debt. Alice said, "It traded at zero. I picked up my coffee. It was cold." That seemed fine to me. Then the cathedral's spire lit up. A golden pillar punched through the roof and reached the clouds. The light was not warm. It was not holy. It was the color of a coin held over a fire. Kane's voice rolled across the city, amplified by every stone in every wall. And it sounded like a man who had decided that if the economy would not obey him, he would replace the economy with himself. He told the crowd to be still. He told them money was a lie invented by demons. He told them he would cancel every debt, abolish every currency, rewrite the definition of value itself. He called it a miracle. He called himself a god. His voice did not sound desperate. That was the part that disturbed me. It sounded rehearsed. The crowd, mid-riot, mid-stampede, mid-scream, stopped. They looked up at the golden light and they believed. Not because it was true, because they were terrified and exhausted, and the man on the spire was offering them a world where the numbers did not matter anymore. A world where the empty vault did not exist, where the relics still had value, where someone with a golden light could simply declare the debt forgiven and make it so. I watched from the warehouse doorway. Above the cathedral, barely visible inside the pillar, Alvin's body floated. He was glowing brighter than the stage had ever made him glow. Kane had overdrawn on his mana contract, past every limit the terms allowed, past the safety thresholds, past the point where the word contract meant anything at all. Alvin was not performing anymore. He was being consumed, and the crowd below him was too busy kneeling to notice. Alice stepped beside me. Her ears were flat against her head. She asked what we do next. I told her that when the opponent declares himself a god, the auditor walks onto the stage. We had 6 days and 20 hours. The castle was still on batteries. Kane was still standing. And 3 trillion mana in profit meant nothing if the man on the spire could convince the world that currency was fiction. He was not playing economics anymore. He was playing religion, and religion does not file quarterly reports. I adjusted my glasses. The golden light made the lenses flare. I made a note to bring the receipts. The service corridor underneath the cathedral smelled like wet iron and old prayers. Gant went first with the manhole cover braced on his shoulder. Alice walked beside me with her terminal open, its blue glow the only light that was not trying to flicker out. The cathedral's emergency power ran through exposed pipes above our heads, humming at a frequency that felt like a headache waiting to happen. I had run the numbers during the walk from the warehouse. Kane's golden pillar was burning through Alvin's contract at a rate that left approximately 4 hours before the draw exceeded anything a human body could sustain without permanent damage. 4 hours. Less time than a board meeting. More than enough to file what I needed to file. Alice had already cracked the broadcast infrastructure. She had been inside the cathedral's commercial backbone since Phase 7, when Demon Credit registered as a domestic financial vehicle. The broadcast screen, the donation counter, the relic purchase ledger, the night payroll database, all of it ran on the same Kingdom commercial network. She told me the screen hack was ready. I told her to hold it until I gave the word. Timing was the only weapon I had ever trusted. Gant stopped at a junction. He pointed left toward the main hall and right toward the service stairs that led to the platform. I told him left. The knights were in the main hall. The screen was in the main hall. Kane was upstairs, but Kane was not the first problem. The first problem was the armed men between us and the screen. Gant hit the main doors with his shoulder, and the iron boomed across the hall like a bankruptcy filing landing on a judge's desk. Every knight in the room turned. There were 12 of them, elite guards in polished armor, spears angled, arranged in a formation that said they had rehearsed this. Kane's voice echoed from the platform above, mid-sermon, something about the death of currency and the birth of paradise. He stopped when the doors opened. I walked through the gap Gant had made. I adjusted my glasses. The golden light from above made everything in the hall look like it was drowning in honey. "Good evening," I said. "Demon Holdings, Chief Financial Officer. I am here to collect." Kane barked an order from the platform. The knights charged. 12 spears, 12 men, 1 corridor's width of space between me and the broadcast screen. I raised one hand. "Alice." She hit the key. The screen behind the altar went dark for half a second. Then it lit up with 12 bank statements. one per night. Each line showed the same thing. A frozen account at Demon Bank, opened in the knight's name without his knowledge, funded by a single deposit of 100 million mana. Beside each balance, a notation. Source of funds, Kane, personal account, categorized as loyalty payment. The hall went quiet. The knights looked at the screen. They looked at me. They looked at each other. I told them the truth. The national banking system was dead. Their domestic savings were inaccessible. Their pensions were denominated in a currency their own employer had just abolished. The overseas accounts I had opened on their behalf were the only liquid assets any of them possessed. 100 million mana each. Clean, accessible, denominated in continental standard units. The condition was simple: drop the spear. Sign a one-page onboarding contract with Demon Holdings as honor guard. I would transmit the access key to their accounts before they reached the door. One knight lowered his spear first, then another, then three at once, then the rest. The clatter of steel on stone sounded like a ledger closing. Kane watched from the platform. His golden light flickered. I told Alice to send the keys. She did. 12 chimes. 12 knights walking toward the exit. One of them paused, turned, and asked if Demon Holdings offered dental. Gant told him yes. I climbed the stairs alone. Gant stayed at the main hall exit. Alice stayed at the terminal. The stairwell narrowed as it climbed, and the golden light grew thicker until the air itself felt heavy. Kane was waiting at the landing. He stood between me and the platform, arms folded, the white suit catching the golden glow in a way that made him look like a cologne advertisement at the end of the world. He did not shout. He spoke calmly, which was worse. He told me he knew who I was before I knew who he was. He told me the bubble was his design, and the relic economy was a business model he had refined across 3 startups in a world that no longer existed. He told me the word for what he was reincarnator, a man from another world, Earth. The same concepts, the same vocabulary, the same understanding of markets and systems and leverage. He told me I should have recognized it sooner. I told him I had recognized it in phase 2, the anonymous email, the pump and dump structure, the 10% automated fee. No one from this world would have designed a product with an automatic resale royalty. He had been advertising his origin in every financial instrument he built. He laughed. He said most people in this world did not even understand what a derivative was. He said I was the only opponent who had ever made him sweat. He asked me whether it felt good, being the smartest person in a room full of people who could not read a spreadsheet. I told him it felt like Tuesday. His expression changed. The smugness cracked at the edges. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device. He said if the market would not serve him, and the knights would not serve him, and the crowd would not serve him, then the crowd would have to be reminded who was in charge. He activated it. The magical frenzy hit the plaza like a pressure wave with no sound. One moment, the crowd below was kneeling in Kane's manufactured devotion. The next, they were on their feet, eyes blank, fists clenched, every body in the square moving toward the cathedral doors. Not just the crowd. Gant's head snapped sideways. His grip on the manhole cover loosened. His eyes went flat, emptied of everything I had come to rely on, and he turned toward me. Alice was worse. She came up the corridor at a dead sprint, her terminal raised above her head like a weapon. Her red eyes were open, but there was nothing behind them that I recognized. No calculation, no teasing edge, no presence. The magical frenzy had taken everything that made her Alice and replaced it with a single instruction: attack the nearest target. I was the nearest target. I ran. There was nothing else to do. An accountant does not punch his way through a mind-controlled crowd. I ducked behind a stone column as Gant's fist cracked the pillar where my head had been. A civilian reached through the gap and grabbed my collar. I pulled free and stumbled backward into the nave. Alice closed the distance. She was faster than I expected. Her tablet came down like a guillotine, and I caught it on my forearm, the edge biting into my sleeve. For a half second, her face was inches from mine, and I saw what the spell had left behind. Nothing. A screen with no signal. I had watched market crashes. I had watched bond prices fall to zero. I had watched a kingdom's credit rating evaporate in 10 minutes and felt nothing except the clean satisfaction of a trade well-timed. I had lost 3 years of my career to a hero who did not know my name, and I had not flinched. Alice's blank face was different. Alice's blank face was the thing that got through. I did not have a line item for what I felt when I saw her eyes empty. I did not have a category. I had a crack in the composure I had carried since chapter 1, and it lasted 2 heartbeats. and it was the loudest silence of my life. She was the only person in the world who could finish my sentences, and she was trying to crack my skull with a piece of equipment I had bought her, and for 2 heartbeats, I was not a CFO or an auditor or a man with a plan. I was just afraid. I let go of the tablet and ran again. Alice stopped mid-swing. Her body locked. Her eyes flickered between blank and present, like a screen rebooting. Her left hand dropped to her terminal, and her fingers moved on muscle memory, tracing a pattern she had been building since she first hacked the broadcast screen. The counterward. She had told me, back in the warehouse, that the broadcast infrastructure carried Kane's spell signatures in its commercial layer. She had been logging those signatures for days, building a pattern recognition model inside her terminal, looking for a frequency match that would let her construct a cancellation wave. She had not finished it. She had said it was 70% done, and she would need live data from the spell itself to complete the last 30. She had just gotten her live data. Her right hand fought her left. The frenzy was pulling her toward me. Her own counterspell was pulling her back. For 3 seconds, she stood frozen in the middle of the hall, her body a battleground between the thing Kane had built and the thing she had built to break it. She slammed the terminal against the column. The device cracked, the screen shattered, and the ward pulsed outward in a silent ring, expanding through the hall like a ripple in still water. Gant blinked. His hands dropped. He looked at the dent his fist had left in the stone column, and then looked at me. He said something polite and mortified that I did not have time to process. The civilians nearest to Alice staggered, shook their heads, looked around in confusion. The ring kept expanding through the plaza. Bodies stopped charging, fists unclenched. The amber haze thinned, and the dawn light broke through, clean and ordinary. Alice slid down the column to the floor. Her terminal was cracked in half. Her hands were shaking. She looked up at me, and her eyes were hers again. 70%, she said. Her voice was raw. Turns out the last 30% was being angry enough. I did not say what I was thinking. I adjusted my glasses instead. The lenses were cracked from when a civilian had grabbed my face. I made a note to submit an expense report for a new pair. Kane had retreated to the platform. The frenzy had failed. The knights were gone. The crowd was waking up. He had 1 card left, and he played it the way a man plays a card when he knows the hand is dead but cannot stand to fold. He reached the apparatus at the center of the platform. Alvin was still connected to it, floating inside the remnants of the golden pillar, barely visible behind the light. Kane's hands moved across the control panel, and the draw rate spiked. The safe ceiling on Alvin's mana contract was a number I had written myself, back when the Energy Department contract was drafted in Phase 5. Kane pushed past it, then past double, then past triple. Alvin's body convulsed. The golden light turned harsh white, and the cathedral shook. Kane was overdrawing the contract the way a failing company draws down its credit line in the last 72 hours before insolvency. He was burning Alvin's capacity to fuel one final attack, and the math said Alvin would not survive the withdrawal rate for more than minutes. Gant's voice came from below. He shouted that the platform was going critical. I could see that. I could also see Mina standing at Kane's right hand, silent, her dark saint costume catching the white light. And behind them both, Celestia, still collared, still standing, still performing the only role anyone had ever asked her to play. Kane raised his hand. A sphere of compressed mana formed above the plaza. It was the size of a carriage, and it glowed like a second sun. He aimed it at the cathedral floor. Mina moved. She stepped forward from Kane's blind spot. 3 steps, quiet, her heeled boots making no sound on the stone. She placed her hand on the barrier device, mounted to the left of the apparatus. The device that kept anyone from reaching Kane. The device that was keyed to the same mana signature as Alvin's contract because Kane had built his entire defense around a single asset he did not own. Mina's hand glowed, a faint pulse, soft as a heartbeat, nothing like the harsh white of the apparatus. The barrier device's surface cracked, then the hum stopped, then the field collapsed. Kane turned. His face was a balance sheet with every line in the red. Disbelief, recalculation, the slow understanding that the woman standing beside him had never been standing with him. Mina spoke. Her voice was flat, no sweetness, no calculation, no performance. The dark saint register, the fake tears from Phase 7, The taunting confidence from the election, all of it gone. What was left was something I had never heard from her before, something true. She told him she was Alvin's saint. She had always been Alvin's saint. From the arrest to the prison to the escape to this cathedral, every step had been about getting close enough to break Cain's hold on the one person she had sworn to protect. She said the dark saint role was the price of admission. She said she had proposed it because Cain was too arrogant to suspect that a woman offering herself as a tool might be offering herself as a weapon instead. She looked at me, and for the second time in one morning, I felt the composure fail. I remembered every calculation I had run on her since phase 6, the probability assessments, the betrayal models, the clean, confident conclusion that Mina was an opportunist who had left the castle because the power went out and the better offer was across the border. I remembered the certainty, the ease of it, the satisfaction of having the answer without doing the work. The math was wrong. I had been too tired to look. I had been pattern matching on insufficient data, and the pattern I found was the one that required the least energy to believe. Mina had not defected. She had infiltrated. She had walked into Cain's circle wearing a costume and a script and a loyalty so quiet that I, the man who reads every line item, had mistaken it for absence. And I had written her off because writing people off was faster than understanding them. There are errors that cost money. There are errors that cost time. And then there are errors that cost you the right to say you see clearly. I filed it. I moved. Alvin was dying. I crossed the platform in 6 steps. The barrier was down. Cain was frozen. Mina was at my back. Alvin was suspended in the apparatus, his body translucent with overdrawn mana, his eyes closed, his breathing so shallow it was barely there. The contract terms I had written were being violated at a rate that would leave nothing of him but a line item. I did not comfort him. I did not tell him it was going to be all right. I picked up a fallen amplification device from the platform floor, switched it on, and aimed it directly at his face. Alvin, no response. His body flickered inside the light. Alvin, are you listening? Because I am only going to say this once, and I am going to say it at the volume you deserve. I took a breath. I let the amplifier do the work. You signed the energy department contract without reading it. You signed the guild insurance forms without reading them. You signed the hero's license renewal every year for 3 years without reading it. And every year, I had to fix the filing because you checked the wrong boxes. You signed Cain's broadcast contract without reading a single clause, and that contract is the reason he is currently using your body as a battery he did not pay for. My voice bounced off the cathedral walls. Gant winced. Mina covered one ear. Civilians in the plaza looked up. I did not care. A warrior who does not read the terms is not a warrior. He is a line item. He is depreciation. He is industrial waste that has not even finished its write-off cycle. And the reason you are floating up there right now, burning through the last of the mana you never understood the value of, is that you have spent your entire career letting other people fill in the numbers for you. Alvin's eyes opened, not gently, not with understanding or gratitude or the quiet awakening of a man who has seen the light. His eyes opened with fury, pure, clean, unreasonable fury, the kind of anger that does not care about context or timing, or the fact that the person yelling at you is trying to save your life, the kind of anger that has been Alvin's defining trait since the day I met him, and the kind of anger I was counting on. "Shut up," he said. His voice was a rasp, barely audible inside the light, then louder. "Shut up!" The golden light around him pulsed. It reversed. The energy that had been flowing out of his body and into Cain's apparatus changed direction. Alvin was not pushing magic. He was pushing rage. The contract terms Cain had violated had broken the safe draw restriction, and with the restriction gone, there was nothing preventing the energy from flowing backward. Alvin grabbed the flow with the only thing he had left, his anger, and he shoved. The apparatus shrieked, metal twisted. The golden light imploded inward, collapsing on itself like a star that had finally read its own expense report and realized it could not afford to keep shining. The platform buckled. Cain was thrown across the stone, his white suit catching fire at the edges, and when he hit the far railing, his body did not bounce. It just stopped. The heavy tax debuff materialized on him like a physical weight. I could see it settle onto his shoulders, dense and absolute. The accumulated unpaid externalities of every scheme he had ever run pressing down on him in visible mass. He did not try to stand. He could not. Gant was on him before the dust settled, one hand on Kane's collar, the manhole cover planted beside them like a flag. Behind me, Mina had already moved to Alvin. He was on the platform floor, breathing hard, conscious, alive. His eyes were closed and his fists were clenched, and he was muttering something about how he was going to file a complaint with Human Resources. Mina knelt beside him and said nothing. She just stayed. Celestia stepped off the platform. The obedience collar around her neck had cracked when the apparatus broke, and she reached up and pulled it away like removing a bandage she had worn for years. She looked at me. I looked at her. She was exhausted. She was standing. She was free. I stood in the middle of the broken platform with the dawn coming through the shattered ceiling and Kane's collar in my peripheral vision, and Mina at Alvin's side, and Celestia walking toward the stairs. The plaza was burning in small patches. The golden light was gone. The cathedral smelled like ozone and broken contracts, and the first honest morning this city had seen in months. The math was wrong about Mina, about Alvin, about what anger was worth when you aimed it at the right line item. I had miscalculated, and the miscalculation had nearly cost me the only asset in the room I could not replace. I adjusted my broken glasses. Dawnlight hit the cracked lenses. I made a note to update the file. The server room smelled like copper and stale prayer. Rows of glowing blue terminals lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Blinking at intervals, nobody had checked in months. We had come down through a service corridor that smelled worse than the cathedral above, and the door to the central bank host room had swung open the moment Alice touched the lock. She pulled up a chair, cracked her knuckles, and got to work. The main terminal lit up under her hands like a dog that missed its owner. "Security is a joke," she said. Her fingers moved across the console in bursts. Kane only built for appearances. The exterior walls are titanium. The interior password is the word password. Gant stood by the door with his manhole cover propped against the wall. He kept glancing at the ceiling, like the weight of the entire kingdom was about to fall through it, which, in financial terms, it already had. Alice pulled up the treasury ledger. Every line was red. The kingdom's reserves had been drained to near zero, but that was the number we expected. The number we did not expect was the outbound queue. 320 billion mana, she said, and turned the screen so I could see. Scheduled transfers to offshore tax havens. And over here are 500 billion from Demon Holdings, frozen but intact. She scrolled further. 8,200 transactions pending, all stuck. I leaned over her shoulder. International transfers in this world ran on the same principle as ours. Settlement required 2 business days through intermediary banks. And because the bank run from last week had clogged every settlement node on the network, and the international community had excluded Elysian from the clearance system the moment Kane's fraud surfaced, these transfers were sitting in a queue with nowhere to go. Kane had fired them off the moment the crash started. He thought they would clear before anyone noticed. They did not clear. They sat in a queue, blinking, waiting for a system that no longer recognized this kingdom as a valid sender. "Can you cancel them?" Alice tilted her head. "I can do better. I have admin access. I can just delete the queue." "Do it." She hit 3 keys. The outbound queue emptied. 8,200 transfers gone. The funds reversed to their origin accounts. 500 billion mana flowed back into Demon Holdings. 320 billion mana settled back into the kingdom's central reserve. Gant stepped forward. "So we take the 320 billion? No. I adjusted my glasses. "We are not thieves, Gant. Thieves take the money. We take the country." I explained it while Alice finished sweeping the system. 3 weeks ago, when the kingdom's government bonds collapsed to near zero, I had bought every outstanding issue with spare change from our overseas account. Worthless paper purchased for fractions of a mana per unit. But worthless paper from a sovereign issuer still carries legal standing. And when I finished buying, Demon Holdings owned more than 50% of the kingdom's sovereign debt. Under the post-treaty framework I had authored in Phase 5, a creditor holding the majority of a defaulting sovereign's structural claims could petition for receivership. The treaty I wrote was the legal basis. The creditor I described was me. I opened a terminal and began drafting the restructuring proposal. It took 7 minutes, not because the restructuring was simple, because I had already drafted it on the carriage ride in. I signed. Alice watched me from her chair. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she turned back to her screen and said very quietly, total capital position, 500 billion owned funds, 300 billion short selling profit from the overseas account, 320 billion managed reserve. That is 1.12 trillion mana, Cliff. I made a note to buy a nicer calculator. The square in front of the cathedral had gone quiet. The guards who had switched sides during the riot were standing in formation now, paid in advance by Demon Holdings at time and a half for hazard duty. The rubble from last night's collapse had been swept into piles that no one had moved yet. Morning light came through the broken windows above, landing on the stage where Kane was kneeling with his hands bound. He was still wearing the white suit, scorched, ripped at the sleeves, stained with dust and humiliation. The heavy tax debuff pressed down on his shoulders like a physical weight. He looked smaller than I remembered. I walked to the edge of the stage and opened the invoice. The charges were straightforward. 3,200 billion mana for embezzlement of the kingdom's sovereign treasury, 500 billion for business interference and market manipulation against Demon Holdings, 100 billion for unauthorized use and physical damage of company equipment, specifically the hero Alvin, moral damages for the magical frenzy deployment, administrative fees for the cleanup. Total outstanding, 3.8 trillion mana. Kane stared at the number. He tried to bargain. He said he had knowledge from his previous life, technologies he could develop, products he could invent. He said he was too valuable to waste. I told him that killing him would not be worth a single mana, but his debt was real. His mana channeling capacity was measurable, and the energy department at Demon Holdings needed a premium contractor. The contract I offered was simple, 300 years, restitution obligation under the economic debt framework. He would report to a channeling station, convert ambient mana at a rate that serviced his debt, and receive standard contractor benefits, including lunch breaks, statutory holidays, and a quarterly performance review. He did not like the contract. Gant helped him understand the alternative was worse. I signed. Alvin came next. Mina was holding his arm, keeping him upright. His hair was limp, his skin pale, his blue eyes still hollowed from the overdraw. He was walking under his own power, but only just. He stopped in front of me and stood as straight as he could, which was not very straight. He expected the worst. He told me he was ready. If I sent him back to the channeling station, he would go. If that was his punishment, he would accept it. I looked at him for a long time. Then I told him he was fired. The color drained from his face. Fired? Your magic circuits are burned out. Your combat value is 0. Your asset rating is 0. You are, by every metric this company tracks, unemployable. Mina's grip tightened on his arm. However, I pulled out a second contract. The energy department needs a site supervisor for the new premium contractor. Someone who understands the channeling station. Someone who can read the output gauges. Someone who can file the quarterly performance reviews. Alvin blinked. You want me to supervise him? Congratulations, I said. You are now Kane's direct manager. Your duties include shift scheduling, output monitoring, and ensuring the contractor's lunch breaks do not exceed the allotted 30 minutes. Choose your words carefully. It is a promotion. He stared at me, then at the contract, then at the stage where Kane had been kneeling 2 minutes ago. The man who had used him as a prop, who had drained him nearly to death on a cathedral platform while the entire kingdom watched, was now going to report to Alvin every morning at 8. Alvin's eyes filled. He took the pen. His hand shook. He signed, and then he cried, and Mina held him and let him. She looked at me over his shoulder. I told her that her apparent defection in the Holy Kingdom had been retroactively reclassified as covert operations conducted for the benefit of Demon Holdings. All charges dropped, full pardon. And since you clearly have a talent for public-facing deception, I said, the PR department has an opening. Her eyes went wide. Then she smiled. It was the first real smile I had seen from her. No performance behind it, no calculation, just relief. She thanked me. She called me a crooked accountant. She said she appreciated it anyway. I signed her contract too. Celestia was waiting by a stone alcove near the back of the court. She had changed out of the ceremonial gown into plain monastery clothes, and without the silver tiara and the obedience collar, she looked like a different person. younger, smaller, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with last night and everything to do with the last several years. She asked me what would happen to her. I told her the truth. The kingdom needed a face, not a ruler, not a decision maker, not someone who would carry the economic burden of restructuring a bankrupt nation from the inside. A face, someone the people already trusted, someone who could stand on a balcony and tell them the truth without flinching, because she had already lived through the worst version of the lie. She would keep the saint title. She would lead honestly. Demon Holdings would provide the infrastructure, the resources, the financial framework. All she had to do was be real. She did not cry. She had used up her tears somewhere in the last few years, and what was left was just a quiet woman standing in gray light, considering whether the offer was a cage or a door. "It is a door," I said, "but I will not pretend there are no walls." She accepted. I noticed her hands had stopped shaking for the first time since I had seen her on that platform. I signed. Celestia stood on the balcony where a week ago, Cain had staged his God act. The crowd below was smaller than it had been then, and quieter. They were the ones who had stayed, the ones who had not fled during the bank run or the riot. They were cold and hungry, and waiting for someone to tell them what came next. She told them the truth. Cain was gone. The virtues he had promised were illusions. The holy relics were fakes. The treasury was empty, the currency was worthless, and the miracles they had been sold were manufactured from a single man's mana at the cost of another man's body. She told them that Demon Holdings had taken on the kingdom's debts, that the nation would be restructured as a consolidated subsidiary, that the currency would be unified under the mana standard, managed by Demon Bank, that the churches would become community centers and tourist sites. That prayer would not bake bread, and bread was what they needed now. The crowd did not cheer, but they did not riot either. They listened, and when she was done, a few of them nodded, and the rest went home to figure out what consolidated subsidiary meant for their rent. I stood behind her, 2 steps back, and watched the city begin to move. Somewhere below, a food distribution line was forming. Somewhere else, the sound of hammers clearing rubble carried up through the morning air. It was not a celebration. It was the first day of a restructuring plan that would take years to complete. But the city was moving, and moving was enough. Alice appeared beside me. She whispered that what we had done looked a lot like colonization. I told her it was group management, a win-win relationship between a parent company and a newly acquired subsidiary. She gave me the look that meant she was not buying it, but would let me have the line. I signed the final restructuring order on the balcony railing and handed it to Celestia's new administrative staff. Then I turned around and told Gant to prepare the transfer gate. We were going home. The transfer gate hummed at the back of the cathedral. 2 packages waited beside it. One was a sealed black iron container that occasionally rattled and produced muffled shouting about being a god. The other was a pair of traveling packs for Alvin and Mina, who would stay behind as Demon Holdings field representatives until the restructuring stabilized. Gant clapped Alvin on the shoulder. Alvin winced but stayed upright. He explained that he had a contract now, a proper one, with a salary and a job title and a supervisor's badge that he intended to wear every single day in Cain's direct line of sight. Mina gave a thumbs up. She said the Demon Army was the best employer she had ever had. Full benefits, overtime pay. She was already planning the first press release. I told them both to file their weekly reports on time. Mina asked if there was a company social media account she could use. I told her that was above my pay grade and walked through the gate before she could ask a follow-up question. Main power came back on the moment the underground plant resumed operation. After a week of emergency lighting that made every corridor look like a horror story, the castle flooded with warm golden light, and I stood in the hallway for 3 seconds just looking at it. Zane met us at the gate. He did not say anything grand. He put one enormous hand on my shoulder and squeezed, and when he pulled back, his crimson eyes were wet. He told me I had done well, and he was glad I was home, and could we please have a banquet? I told him we could discuss the banquet after the financial report. The boardroom had been cleaned in our absence. Someone had polished the round table and replaced the whiteboard markers. Alice sat in her usual chair with a limited edition Demon Realm pudding she had apparently been saving, and Gant leaned against against the wall in his new armor, looking like a man who had finally found a building that was not actively trying to kill him. I pulled up the report. 620 billion mana in liquid funds. Total consolidated position once the kingdom's subsidiary integration completed. 1.12 trillion mana. More than double last year's annual revenue earned in a single week. Zane's mouth opened. He said something about only asking for a market research trip. I reminded him that mergers and acquisitions were a form of market research. He asked if what we had done made us look like invaders. I told him the kingdom's population was thanking us. Celestia sent daily emails of gratitude. The restructuring plan would turn the Holy Kingdom into the continent's primary food production base and tourist destination within 18 months. He leaned back in his chair. He said something about me being more ruthless than a demon king, which I took as a compliment and filed for future performance review reference. Then I told them the next step. Demon Holdings had outgrown private ownership. Our market capitalization exceeded the threshold where staying unlisted was structurally inefficient. The Holy Kingdom acquisition had surfaced the question every growing company eventually faces. We needed access to larger capital markets. We needed regulatory legitimacy. We needed the social proof that came from a public listing. We were going to pursue an initial public offering on the World Stock Exchange. Alice stopped eating her pudding. She asked if she could manipulate the stock price. I told her no. She asked if she could buy shares at the employee discount. I told her that was a conversation for legal. Gant asked what a stock buyback was. I told him it was a way for the company to buy its own shares on the open market. He nodded slowly, pretending to understand. Zane asked if the IPO meant more paperwork. I told him it meant all of the paperwork. He screamed, quietly, into his hands. I made a note to start the filing process in the morning. But before I closed the report, I added one final item under the personnel section. The energy department now had a premium contractor at the channeling station, a 300-year restitution contract. The contractor's name was Kane. His site supervisor was Alvin. And according to Mina's first unofficial status update, sent via the company's internal messaging system approximately 40 minutes ago, the two of them had already found the break room and were arguing about which video game to play during their lunch hour. I closed the report. The boardroom was quiet. The lights were on. The company was bigger than it had been a week ago. The original Revenge was closed. The Holy Kingdom Arc was closed. And somewhere in a basement channeling station, the man who had tried to become a god was losing an argument about turn order in a card game, supervised by the man who had once been too useless to read a contract. That seemed fine to me. The whiteboard behind me had 3 columns: revenue, costs, next target. The first 2 were full. The third had one word circled twice in red: IPO. I walked the room through the numbers. 1.12 trillion mana total once the Holy Kingdom integration settled. Operating margin healthy. Reserve buffer adequate. The balance sheet of a company that had no business still being called an army. Zane raised his hand like he was in school. He proposed a special benefit of 1 billion mana per citizen. I told him that would cause hyperinflation so severe a loaf of bread would cost $1 billion. He lowered his hand, then raised it again. A 1-month, all expenses paid company trip to the Holy Kingdom. The undead department cheered. Gant slammed his fist on the table in support. Denied. I adjusted my glasses. If we leave the castle empty for a month, someone invades. I approved a partial welfare expansion because productive investment was different from a parade. Then I moved to the third column. We were going to take the Adventurers Guild apart, not by force, by platform. Alice had already built the infrastructure. We needed to ship the app, steal the market, and then buy the corpse. But the app alone was not enough. Nobody trusts a product from the Demon Army. We needed legitimacy. We needed a listing on the World Securities Exchange. Once we are public, I said, no one can call us monsters. They will call us shareholders. Zane asked if they could go on company trips after the IPO. I told him stock options would let him go anywhere. He approved the plan so fast the whiteboard rattled. I started calling securities firms that afternoon. Every one of them rejected us. The letters came back stamped with the same word: anti-social designation. The Demon King's army was classified as a threat to public order, and no human world underwriter would touch us. Carmilla arrived without warning, which was how she always arrived. One moment, the office smelled like paper and cold coffee. The next, it smelled like old money and something floral that cost more than my quarterly bonus. She scanned the rejection letters on my desk, read 2 of them upside down, and snapped her fan shut. She told me that if the surface securities companies would not play, I should use the underground. She slid a business card across my desk, gold leaf on black cardstock. The name on it was Goblin Sachs. It was a non-starter, except it was the only option left. We met the president in a dim office 50 floors below the surface. Short, gold teeth, tailored suit that cost more than the office. He offered to handle the entire IPO through backdoor connections with enough bribes to grease every listing examiner on the continent. His commission, 10%. Standard was 7. 10 was predatory. I counterproposed. A green shoe option with a mandatory price stabilization clause. If the initial stock price fell below the offering price within the first quarter, Goblin Sachs would be obligated to buy shares with its own capital to stabilize the market. Failure to stabilize meant the entire 10% commission was forfeited. In other words, their fee was tied to our success. If the stock performed, they earned a fortune. If it cratered, they ate the difference. The president hesitated. Carmilla leaned forward and asked if he was frightened. He signed. I locked the major shareholders into a 180-day sell restriction. Carmilla did not blink. The Demon King would not notice. Phase 2 of the IPO was underway. The paperwork phase nearly killed us. Alice and I ran 3 magical computers each, filling out registration statements that weighed more than Gantt. Then, the air in the room changed. A pressure that smelled like courtrooms and old grudges filled the office. Viper walked in, carrying the Holy Law Compendium under his arm. He had traded the courtroom for a civil service desk, compliance officer for the listing review committee, a demotion dressed as a lateral move. He opened the compendium and rejected our preliminary application on the spot. The company charter listed its management philosophy as world conquest. It was, he said, in violation of public order. I summoned a holographic keyboard and rewrote the charter in front of him. World conquest became global market share expansion and stakeholder happiness maximization. 16 syllables that said the same thing and violated nothing. Alice whispered that the Demon King might be upset. I told her the Demon King could not spell stakeholder. Viper's compendium scanned the new language and found no violation. He accepted the change, but he did not leave satisfied. He warned us that the next audit would target our executives and our assets, specifically the fire-breathing dragon on the board and whatever we were hiding underground. He meant the energy department. He meant Kane and Alvin. The door closed behind him. I called an emergency meeting. Volcanoes needed a compliance crash course before the investor briefing, and the energy department needed to be audit-proof by the time Hilda and Viper came looking. The investor briefing opened in the castle's reception hall. Goblin Sachs had gathered every dark investor on the continent. A Lich King who had lived 3,000 years, a dwarf billionaire, mafia bosses, an entire row of shadowy figures whose portfolios could fund a small nation. I had given Volcanoes one instruction: do not speak, do not breathe fire, do not threaten anyone. He lasted 12 minutes. A dark elf investor asked about competitive risk from heroes. Volcanoes stood up, demolished a desk with one claw, breathed fire at the ceiling, and told the room he would burn anyone who did not buy shares. The investors fled. The pre-IPO valuation crashed from 10 trillion mana to 1.2 trillion in the time it took the smoke to clear. The entire drop meant the market was pricing us at 0 business value, cash only. I docked Volcanoes' pay, assigned 100 hours of compliance training, and banned him from the field. Then I pivoted. Mina had been standing in the back of the room through the entire disaster. I told her she was the new face of the company, a former saint with a public image problem, presenting a demon army company with a public image problem. The math worked. She negotiated a limited edition handbag as her success fee and agreed on the spot. The valuation was ruined, but valuations could be rebuilt. What I needed was proof of earnings, a product the market could price. I told Alice to ship UShare. Alice pressed the release button at 11 that night. The app was simple. Adventurers connected directly with clients. 5% commission, same-day payment, no guild, no branch fees, no noble tributes, no mysterious cooperation surcharges. The 25% the guild skimmed became 95% in the adventurer's pocket. Within a week, the guild's quest volume dropped 90%. Active users curved upward in a line so steep, Alice started calling it the hockey stick. She suggested we boost the servers. I told her the humans had been waiting for this their entire careers. In a capital city guild branch, an F-rank adventurer named Kyle walked up to the counter and collected 500 mana for a quest worth 2,500. He had seen the deductions before: brokerage fee, branch operation fee, royal tax, and 3 more charges with names nobody recognized. He opened the app, found a herb gathering job worth 2,000 mana, finished it in an hour, and got paid on the spot. He told every adventurer he knew. They told everyone else. Mina handled the interviews. I told her to claim she had invented the app herself. A former saint turned tech entrepreneur. The press ate it. The stock crawled upward, but Viper was still out there, and he had promised an audit. Hilda and Viper arrived together. The worst possible audit team. A tax genius and a legal genius, united by the shared conviction that I was hiding something ugly underground. I led them down 100 floors, past mithril alloy security doors, past warning signs about high concentration magical reactions, past iris authentication, and into the 6th management area. They expected chains. They expected suffering. They expected the kind of scene that ends a company. They found Kane and Alvin sitting in gaming chairs, screaming at a cooperative dungeon crawler on a floating display, surrounded by empty chip bags and limited edition anime boxes. The room was the size of a large closet. It smelled like salt and arguments about turn order. Alice explained the system. The earth veins beneath the castle carried massive geothermal energy contaminated with harmful miasma. Kane and Alvin's holy aura acted as a biological filter. When they were relaxed and happy, the filtration efficiency peaked. The chips, the games, the anime, all of it was maintaining optimal purification output. Hilda picked up a stack of snack receipts and accused me of embezzlement. I told her the potato chips were fuel adjustment costs. The game software was capital equipment investment. The anime collection was a long-term maintenance catalyst. I showed her the purification output monitors. The math was airtight. Cost per unit of clean energy was lower than any alternative. She ran the numbers on her magical calculator twice and conceded. The accounting logic was, in her words, infuriatingly perfect. Viper tried a different angle. He offered to free them. He told Kane he could file for release and be out within a day. Kane did not even turn around. He said no. He said the outside world meant working, and this was paradise. Games, snacks, and people thanking him for saving the world just by sitting there. Alvin agreed. He called it the best job he ever had. Viper's objection died in his throat. No forced labor, no coercion. The victims did not want to leave. Hilda stamped the financial audit approved. Viper stamped the legal audit approved. They left in silence. I made a note to order more chips. The audit stamps were still warm when Marquis Pork made his move. An emergency communication from Parliament. The Marquis demanded the immediate release of all former heroes under a human rights protection bill and threatened to freeze Demon Holdings' kingdom-side assets and designate us as a terror organization. It was a desperation play. The IPO momentum had spooked him, and his offshore accounts were exposed the moment anyone looked hard enough. Hilda was still in the building. I handed her a dossier. 3 billion mana in tax evasion through fake donations to a human rights fund. The fund Pork was now using as his legal basis to attack us. The circularity was almost beautiful. Hilda's monocle flared green. She did not need convincing. She had been hunting Pork for years. I was just the one who handed her the trigger. She led the raid herself. Her auditors stormed Parliament mid-session. Pork was mid-speech about the sacred duty of protecting heroes when the tax bureau kicked open the doors. Every assembly member's assets went under immediate review. Viper, who was still in the corridor, watched the whole thing. He told me not to be careless, but his voice carried something that sounded almost like respect. The commercial filmed the next morning. Mina directed. Alvin sat on a metal chair under studio lights, wearing the clothes of a man who had lost everything and told the truth. He had been an S-rank hero. The guild took 80%. When his sword broke and his accounts were frozen, the guild cut him loose. No insurance, no support, no exit plan. All that was left were debts and regret. He looked into the camera. His eyes were wet but steady. He told adventurers to manage their own worth. The UShare logo appeared. 5% fee, same-day payment. Mina called cut. She told him his dead fish eyes were worthy of a royal art award. Alvin slumped in his chair and asked if he could go play games with Kane. The The commercial went viral by sundown. Guild orders dropped 40% in 72 hours. The guild master smashed a vase, screamed at his staff, reviewed the numbers, and reached for his phone. He called Viper. Viper's response came through every magical broadcast in the kingdom simultaneously. An emergency press conference. He announced the formation of the National Hero Corporation, a state-run institution replacing the Adventurers Guild. All dungeons under state management. 0 entry fees, 0 commission, funded entirely by taxes. Adventurers celebrated. They uninstalled UShare and rushed to register. Alice reported the daily active user crash from her terminal. Gant asked if we should match the price and go free. I told him a price war against an opponent with a printing press was a death sentence for the private sector. This was predatory pricing legalized as public welfare. The state could bleed money because the state could tax. We could not, but free always creates distortions. I told Alice to watch the subcontracting structure, watch the on-site compensation. When the state cuts costs to keep the service running, the cracks would show in the field. It was non-cash. We could afford to wait. The cracks showed inside 2 weeks. Kyle went back. The national dungeon offered free entry, so he cleared 5 goblins and walked up to the counter expecting market rate. He received 100 mana. The receptionist explained the deductions: safety management fee, civil servant hero dispatch fee, facility maintenance, reconstruction special tax, mysterious cooperation surcharge. The original budget had been 100 million mana per district. Alice and I mapped the subcontracting chain through public records. Primary contractor took 30%, secondary took 20 of the remainder, tertiary took 15 of what was left. By the time the money reached the adventurers, 95% had been siphoned by shell companies connected to noble families. The adventurers had traded a 25% guild fee for a 95% state fee. The hamburger had been ordered, but only the sesame seed arrived. Kyle broke his guild card at the counter. He reinstalled UShare before he reached the door. The review sites told the rest of the story. National Dungeon, 1.2 stars. UShare, 4.8. I let the numbers speak. The mass exodus back to the app was public, visible, and devastating. Every adventurer who returned was a taxpayer who now understood what free had cost them. The National Hero Corporation was bleeding 200 billion mana per month. That deficit was going to land on someone's doorstep. I intended to make sure every citizen knew whose. Alice and I had been positioning short sells on the kingdom's sovereign bonds since the state corporation launched. The math was already done. We just needed the trigger. I sent Mina out with the flyers. Her team distributed them to every household in the capital. The design was simple. 1 number, large font, center of the page, the per household annual tax burden if the National Hero Corporation continued operating. Below it, a single line. Your skipped lunch paid for a noble's shell company. A housewife named Maria read hers while shopping. Her share was 100,000 mana, 3 months of her part-time salary. She dropped her basket. She was not the only one. By evening, the capital was on fire. Not literally, but every street corner had a cluster of citizens holding the flyer and shouting at the palace. The protests gathered mass, the way a bank run gathers speed. 1 family told 2, 2 told 10. By midnight, the crowd outside the National Assembly stretched 5 blocks deep. Inside Parliament, Viper was trying to save it. He proposed an emergency poll tax, 12 mana per citizen, regardless of income. He told the assembly that opposing him was treason. The nobles sat pale and sweating. The sound of the crowd outside shook the stone walls. Somewhere, a window cracked. I walked in through the gallery entrance with Hilda beside me. Gant held the door. Hilda dropped a file on the podium. Citizen asset data. Average savings, near 0. Annual income for the poor, 40 mana. A 12 mana poll tax on people with nothing would trigger national bankruptcy within a fiscal quarter. Then I showed the room a holographic chart. The kingdom's government bond prices, crashing in real time. A waterfall on the screen. Goblin Sachs had published a sovereign downgrade report that morning. Our short positions had been executing all day. The kingdom's debt was uninvestable. The poll tax could not offset the deficit. The emergency reserves were gone. The math was over. Viper called me a devil. I told him I was just teaching market rules. Before the law, before the parliament, before the army, there was the economy. And the economy did not negotiate. The mob broke through the bronze gates. Gant stepped aside. The assembly members members screamed, tripped over their own robes, and ran for every exit. Within minutes, the chamber was empty except for Viper, standing alone on the podium, gripping the Holy Law Compendium with white knuckles. The kingdom's government was effectively over. I found him in a back office, small room, one desk, an overturned chair. The sounds of the crowd were muffled through the stone walls, but still present, like a heartbeat that would not stop. Viper was sitting behind the desk. The compendium was closed on the table in front of him. His tie was loosened. His eyes were flat. He had no clients left. Pork was in custody. Bulgia's guild was a shell. The state corporation was bankrupt. Every institution he had used as a weapon was a ruin. And the man who had ruined all of them was standing in the doorway with a business card. I set the card on the desk. Chief Legal Officer, Demon Holdings, fully aligned compensation package, green shoe style equity that vested over 3 years. His objection skill had beaten me once. I wanted it on my side. He stared at the card for a long time. Then he picked it up and turned it over, as if looking for a trap clause on the back. The same skill that cost you everything at the guild trial, he said, and you want it in your boardroom. I told him the skill was not the problem. The flag was, and the flag had just changed. He signed. The contract went into my briefcase next to the bond crash projections and the Goblin Sachs underwriting term sheet. Viper's first line as an ally was dry, clipped, and useful. He asked when the listing examination started and whether I had pre-filed the executive disclosure forms. I told him they were on his new desk. It was a non-starter, what the kingdom had tried to do. All of it. The nationalization, the poll tax, the predatory pricing. You cannot beat a balance sheet with a printing press. The math always wins. And the math had just hired itself a lawyer. The click of low heels on marble arrived before she did. Hilda walked through the wrecked doorframe without stepping on a single piece of debris, which was either professionalism or spite. She looked at Viper and told him he had fallen low. He smiled and told her his first job as CLO would be to hand her a financial statement so flawless it would make her monocle crack. Then she turned to me. Her voice dropped the temperature of the room by several degrees. She wanted me to understand that her cooperation during the bond crash was for justice only. Tax evasion enforcement, nothing personal, nothing friendly. And if she ever found even one mana unaccounted for in our public filings, she would post a seizure warrant on the castle gate herself. I thanked her, sincerely. A clean ledger was exactly what we needed. A publicly traded company could not afford ambiguity, and neither could I. She left without looking back, already walking toward the parliament members' hidden accounts. Viper watched her go and said what I was thinking. She was a woman of her word. His first assignment was clear: produce a set of quarterly statements that would give Hilda nothing to swing at. I looked at the ceiling. The IPO examination was in 3 days, and the government still had the power to pressure the exchange. But the government had just lost its parliament, its bond market, and its best lawyer. That seemed fine to me. The final day of the listing examination arrived on a Tuesday because stock exchanges have no sense of drama. The finance bureau director sat at the far end of the table with his colleagues flanking him. He smiled the smile of a man who had already been told the outcome. Alice, next to me, was gripping the edge of her seat so hard the wood creaked. The director read the rejection. Administrative guidance. The government had concerns about the Demon King's army participating in the public securities market. The exchange had been advised, informally, to deny us. He folded his hands and waited for us to leave. I asked for the legal basis. He laughed, called it the way adults handle things, suggested we file a lawsuit if we were unhappy. By the time a court ruled, he said, our company would be dust. I picked up my coffee, took a sip, set it down. Your turn, CLO. The door opened. Viper walked in carrying the Holy Law Compendium in both hands, and every government official in the room recognized him before he finished his bow. Their former boss, their former special advisor, the man who had written half the regulations they were now hiding behind. He examined the rejection notice for exactly 4 seconds. Then he called it what it was: illegal. Administrative guidance, he explained to the room as though lecturing first-year students. was a voluntary cooperation request. Using it to deny a listing was a violation of the Administrative Procedure Act. Attempting to exclude a specific company from the market was a violation of the Anti-Monopoly Act. And doing it on direct government instruction constituted abuse of authority. The director's smile died. Viper continued. If the rejection stood, he would file personal damage claims against every official in the room, not a state lawsuit. Personal. 1 trillion mana in estimated damages, split proportionally. Their pensions, their homes, their retirement accounts, all of it. He asked them, very politely, whether they would like to proceed with their illegal administrative guidance, or whether they would prefer to stamp the approval and preserve their life savings. The director's voice cracked. He told the exchange chairman to approve the listing immediately. The gavel came down. The chairman read the ruling. Demon Holdings, Cumberland Limited, was approved for public listing on the World Securities Exchange. Alice exhaled. Viper closed the compendium and tucked it under his arm. He told me his first observation as CLO was that I was dangerously close to needing him permanently, because my methods would cross a line sooner or later if left unsupervised. I told him I was always clean. He did not laugh, but his mouth twitched. The same skill that had humiliated me at the guild hearing in the early days, the same objection that had made my audit magic look like a party trick, had just forced an entire regulatory body to fold in 10 minutes. And now it was mine, approved. A few days after the approval, I presented the final piece to the executive table. Alice had the screens up. Viper had the legal review in hand. The Adventurer Partnership System, stock acquisition rights, distributed to every active U-share user, 100 billion mana in total purchase right value, with a 12-month lockup. Leave the platform during the lockup, and the rights are forfeited. Viper read the document twice. He said what I expected him to say. Stock options were normally reserved for officers and employees. I was handing them to outside contractors, individual adventurers. I told him that was the point. I did not want users. I wanted believers. People who would wake up every morning and check the stock price before they checked their quest board, because their net worth was now tied to the company they worked through. They would not badmouth us. They would not leave. Criticizing Demon Holdings would mean criticizing their own portfolio. Alice asked how we would turn users into believers when a 5% commission had already made them treat us like saviors. I told her we would show them a dream. From today, every adventurer on U-Share was no longer a contractor. They were an owner, a shareholder, a partner in the Demon King's army. Viper set the document down and said the word I was waiting for. Brilliant. Legally, a stock grant agreement. Psychologically, a fate-sharing pact. The notification went out that evening. Kyle was sitting on the edge of a dried-up fountain when his U-Share terminal chimed. He read the notification 3 times. Stock acquisition rights, 1-year lockup. The value of his grant would scale with the company's market performance. He was an F-rank adventurer. He owned 1 iron sword, 1 leather chest guard, and exactly enough savings to eat for 2 more weeks. And now, a piece of the largest company in the kingdom had his name on it. He stood up, read the terms one more time. The lockup clause was clear. Stay on the platform for 12 months, keep working, and the rights would vest. Leave, and they evaporated. He did not care about the lockup. For the first time in his career, somebody had handed him something and called it his. He said it out loud to nobody in particular. He was on the demon army's side now. He would run more quests, earn more stock, and if the price went up, he would buy decent equipment for the first time in his life. Across the kingdom, tens of thousands of adventurers were having the same conversation with themselves. And in every guild hall from the capital to the frontier, the quest boards went dark. Bolgia stood in the main hall of the Adventurers Guild and listened to silence. The quest boards were blank. The reception counter had no line. The last adventurer to walk out had thrown his guild badge into the trash bin by the door and told Bolgia, on his way past, that the demon army treated him as a partner, not a wallet. The guild was 1,000 years old. It had survived wars, plagues, and 3 separate demon invasions. It had not survived a stock option. IPO day. The world's stock exchange trading floor was built for moments that made history, and this one obliged. Crowds packed the gallery. Wyvern cavalry reporters circled the skylight. The ticker boards lining the walls were blank, waiting for a single number. We stood on the listing platform. Zane, in his formal armor, waved at the crowd like he was greeting an army, which technically he was. Alice stood behind him with her arms crossed. hiding a grin. Viper kept his distance from the edge of the platform, reading the ticker boards with the expression of a man already calculating his commission. Carmilla was in the front row of the gallery, legs crossed, folding fan open, not clapping, but not unimpressed. Alvin stood at the back of our group, stiff, nervous. I did not blame him. The last time he had been in front of this many people, he was a hero. Now, he was a line item on a headcount report, and somehow he looked more comfortable that way. The exchange chairman handed Zane the ceremonial bell cord, 300 years of listing history. Every major corporation in the kingdom had been christened by the sound of this bell. Zane took the cord. "Power control is perfect," he told me, grinning. He pulled. The bell did not ring. It cracked. Then it shattered. Bronze fragments scattered across the platform like corporate shrapnel, and the exchange chairman's face went the color of old parchment. Zane stood there, holding a frayed rope attached to nothing. He told the room the bell had been brittle. He had barely touched it. The crowd went silent. Then someone in the gallery laughed. Then the whole floor was laughing, and the ticker boards lit up anyway, because the exchange does not wait for ceremony. Opening price, 1,000 mana. Buy orders overwhelmed the sell side within minutes. The price would not form. Special buy quota. The underwriters at Goblin Sachs were screaming into their headsets, demanding inventory, trying to match the demand that was flooding in from every corner of the kingdom. Alice watched the numbers climb and told me the price had tripled in the first hour. 3,000 mana per share. By close, it hit 3,200. Market cap, 12.8 trillion mana, more than half the kingdom's national budget. Kyle was somewhere in the crowd, gripping his terminal, watching his F-rank stock options multiply by 3 in a single afternoon. He was an owner now, a real one. Goblin Sachs's fees scaled with the stock price per the green shoe clause from the underwriting agreement. The stock tripled, their payout tripled, and for the first time in the history of underworld finance, nobody at the firm was complaining about a client. I let the number settle, 12.8 trillion. The figure was abstract. What was not abstract was the fact that every adventurer, every shareholder, every institutional investor who had bet on us that morning was now richer than they had been at breakfast, and every one of them had a reason to stay. Alice found me at the back of the trading floor as the closing bell sounded. She did not say anything. She just stood next to me, and for one moment the floor noise fell away, and there was nothing to calculate. Then I stepped to the press microphone. I told the room that Demon Holdings would be making a tender offer for the Adventurers Guild at double net asset value, effective immediately. The room went quiet again, but this time nobody laughed. Approved. I did not attend the guild's emergency council meeting. I sent Viper. He walked into the chamber carrying a briefcase full of cash offers and a stack of stock option conversion agreements. 10 council members sat around the stone table. Bolgia, at the head, slammed his fist and told them not to sell. The guild was humanity's fortress. It had stood for 1,000 years. Pride, honor, duty. The elder counselor next to him asked, trembling, how much pride was worth per share. Their voting rights were worthless paper on a collapsing institution. Cliff was offering double. Another counselor stood up and shouted that the guild's revenue had fallen 95%. Pride did not cover salaries. Pride did not pay for building maintenance. Pride did not stop the adventurers from leaving. Viper set the briefcase on the table and opened it. Special retirement bonuses. Demon Holdings stock options. A golden parachute for every counselor who signed before midnight. One by one, they signed. They called it profit-taking. The word Bolgia used was betrayal. The word they used was arithmetic. Within 72 hours, Demon Holdings controlled 80% of the Adventurers Guild's voting rights. I walked into the Adventurers Guild headquarters on a Tuesday afternoon. Gant was at my right shoulder. Alice was at my left. Viper followed with the legal paperwork. Mina had the cameras running. The staff had already been given their new contracts. They stood in their new uniforms and bowed when I entered. The transition had been smoother than I expected, which meant it had been smoother than Bolgia expected too. He was standing at the back of the lobby, the guildmaster, the last man in the building who still believed the sign above the door meant something. He told me I had defiled his guild. I did not answer him. I was looking at the reception counter. It was oak, heavy, old. The kind of counter that had been polished by 1,000 years of hands and paperwork and quiet, daily humiliation. 3 years of my life had been spent on the other side of counters like this one. Filing forms nobody read. Requesting permits, nobody approved. Standing in line behind adventurers who did not know my name. To submit invoices to clerks who did not care. For a hero who thought accounting was a waste of a party slot. I had never raised my voice at any of those counters. I had never complained. I had filed. I had waited. I had gone home. I looked at Gant. He already knew. He stepped forward, pulled the hammer from his back, and brought it down on the reception counter with one clean strike. The oak split, the surface caved in. Papers and forms, and the little brass bell that receptionists rang to call the next number scattered across the lobby floor. The sound of it traveled through the stone walls and out into the street. Nobody moved. Bulgia's face was gray. The cameras caught all of it. I stepped into the empty space where the counter had been. Below my feet, the dust was still settling. I could feel the echo of the hammer strike in the floor tiles, and I could feel something older than that, something 3 years deep, settling with it. I announced the renovation. The Adventurers Guild headquarters would be converted into a 24-hour retail logistics hub. Adventurers would sell their materials directly to consumers. No guild intermediary. No 25% commission, no counter. The name on the sign would change by morning. Demon Mart, Royal Capital, store number 1. Then I turned and walked out. I did not look at Bulgia again. The counter was enough. Weeks passed. The first time I walked into Demon Mart during operating hours, a housewife was haggling with an adventurer over the price of orc meat. The adventurer was offering 5% off for app payment. The housewife was asking whether the fat content looked right. Neither of them noticed me. That seemed fine to me. Viper had taken the old guildmaster's office as his CLO suite and lined the walls with security monitors. He told me, with the expression of a man who had found his calling, that the store had passed every food hygiene inspection on the first attempt. He had written the compliance manual himself, exploiting every loophole in the kingdom's food sanitation law to meet the standard without spending a single unnecessary mana. The officials who had stamped the permits had done so with visible frustration, and Viper had framed their faces from the security footage. Mina ran the launch media from a makeshift studio in the back. She had the regional broadsheets, the Wyvern Courier services, and 3 independent Crystal broadcast networks covering the opening week. The coverage was wall to wall. Demon Mart was the story. Below the new Demon Mart, below the pipes and the mana conduits, and the geothermal purification plant that powered half the kingdom, Alvin and Kane were playing their cooperative dungeon crawler on adjoining screens. A bag of potato chips sat between them, half crushed. The stock ticker floated in the corner of Alvin's display, and every few minutes he glanced at it and grinned. Kane asked him if he ever planned to leave. Their stock options alone were worth enough to retire on. Alvin told him not to be stupid. Outside, he would be recognized as the former hero. Down here, his gaming powered the Demon Mart above, and that was the ultimate contribution to society. Kane considered this for a moment, then agreed. Their leisure was the engine of a 15 trillion mana economy. There was a kind of dignity in that. An undead worker shuffled past them, carrying a paid leave request slip. He was heading upstairs to see his family's grave for the first time in 200 years. Neither Alvin nor Kane looked up from their screens, but Alvin called out to have a good trip. Market cap, 15 trillion mana. Gross merchandise value exceeding the kingdom's national budget. 70% of the population using at least one demon holding service. U-Share, Demon Mart, the Mana Cap and Trade Exchange, the geothermal energy grid, the bond market. I read the numbers on the floating display and let them sit in the room for a moment. Alice was perched on the edge of the meeting table with a pudding spoon in her mouth, which was her version of formal attire. Gant stood by the door, polishing nothing in particular, which meant he was listening. Zane was already looking at the map. The red zones, areas where our logistics and financial networks had penetrated, covered the entire continent. National borders were lines on an old drawing. The real borders were supply chains, and they were all ours. I should have kept it to numbers. I usually did. But the room was warm, and the sunset through the windows was doing something to the light. And for once, I said what I meant instead of what the spreadsheet said. I told them the 15 trillion figure was not mine. The technology was Alice's. The logistics were Gant's. The public face was Mina's. The legal armor was Viper's. The energy was the 2 idiots downstairs. And the trust, the unreasonable, mathematically unjustifiable trust that had started everything was Zane's. I told them the number was the price of what we had built together, the crystallization of sweat and code and punches thrown at the right doors, and one very expensive replacement bell. Alice's pudding spoon stopped moving. Gant looked at the floor. Zane's crimson eyes were suspiciously bright. I caught myself, cleared my throat, told them to forget I said that because it was unlike me and I had a reputation to maintain. Zane did not forget. He stood up and announced, with the volume of a man who had once flattened armies, that the entire company was going on an all-expenses-paid luxury vacation. Resort Island, Southern Ocean, 100% paid leave consumption. Every employee from the executive floor to the undead workers' break room. Alice wanted to bring the 2 underground gamers. Gant asked if he could bring his manhole shield. Zane was already talking about swimsuits. I approved the budget. Investing in employee motivation was part of a CFO's job, and the company had earned it. That evening, as the fireworks went off over the Capitol and the Demon Mart sign glowed against the night sky, I sat at my desk one more time. The announcement had gone out. The trip was confirmed. The numbers were filed. The story, as far as anyone reading these reports would know, had reached a good place. I looked at the profit report one last time. 15 trillion. 3 years ago, I had been the man behind the counter, filing forms for a hero who did not know my name. Now the counter was kindling. The hero was a happy gamer, and the company I had built was worth more than the kingdom that had fired me. I made a note to pack lightly. Approved. The trip budget sat on my desk like a small indictment. Teleportation for tens of thousands of employees would consume half the national mana reserve. Carriages and ships would burn 2 weeks each way, which meant a full month of travel for 2 weeks of beach. Neither number survived a cost-benefit analysis. Alice leaned over the projection, scrolling through transport options. Everything is either too expensive or too slow. I pulled up the castle's infrastructure manifest. Underground Hangar 8. The entry I had been pretending not to see for 11 phases. There is a floating fortress in the basement, I said. The previous Demon King built it to engulf the world in flames. It never flew because the fuel cost was absurd. Gant looked at the schematic. That is a weapon of mass destruction, sir. It is a vehicle with excess capacity. I opened a requisition form. Kane was already contracted to the energy department as a mana channeler. His output was functionally infinite. If I routed his feed through the fortress's propulsion array, the fuel cost dropped to 0. In exchange, I approved a gaming communication link so he could play during the flight. The math was clean. Alice had the renovation specs drafted by noon. Cannons stripped, observation decks installed, barracks converted to suites, climate control upgraded. The undead workers handled overnight construction. By morning, the fortress gleamed white in the hangar lights, and Zane stood on the bow in an aloha shirt and sunglasses, arms spread wide, shouting something about the wind that I chose not to hear. I named it Demon Airlines. We boarded. The fortress lifted off for a half-day flight to a tropical island in the Southern Sea that no kingdom had bothered to claim. 5 minutes into the flight, Zane was hosting a barbecue on the observation deck. A slime employee had crawled into the water tank. Gant was eating grilled meat instead of maintaining order. Smoke drifted across my deck chair. I took the intercom. Attention, all employees. I am distributing a compliance manual. The table of contents alone is 50 pages. The only rule that matters is this: do not increase my workload. Violations result in immediate dismissal and forfeiture of all stock options. Viper, our chief legal officer, will enforce. Viper stepped forward in a purple aloha shirt and sunglasses, Holy Law Compendium under one arm. He explained the penalties with the same dry lethality he had used on state officials. The observation deck went silent. Employees switched to approved recreational activities within 90 seconds. I returned to my chair. That seemed fine to me. The island was everything the budget projection had promised. White sand, emerald water, palm shade at the correct angle for afternoon reading. Zane launched himself into the waves. The undead workers followed with inflatable rings, politely reminding him to stretch first. Mina was already taking photos for the company's social feed. Gant set up volleyball. Alice ate cold pudding under a palm tree, building sandcastles between bites. I set up my deck chair, opened a novel, and ordered a coconut juice from the local cat beastman vendor. 30 minutes passed. Zane invited me to swim. I declined. The juice had not arrived, but I attributed it to island pace. 1 hour passed. Alice noted I was still reading. I noted the juice was very late. 2 hours passed. The beastman returned, drenched in sweat, holding a lukewarm coconut shell. I drank it. It was warm and watery. I asked him to explain the delay. He told me he climbed the tallest tree on the far side of the island for each order, washed the fruit at a distant spring, cracked it with a stone for half an hour, and had no ice because the village chief with ice magic was on a business trip. I put down my novel. I picked up the calculator I had sealed in my bag for vacation. "Take me to your village," I said. "Fruit storage, processing, transport routes. I am going to restructure your supply chain." The village was worse than the juice. Every beastman performed every task alone. The monkey climbed and picked and washed and delivered. The dog did the same. Nobody specialized. I divided them. Monkeys pick, dogs transport, bears process, cats serve. Alice built a cooling pool using diverted spring water and earth magic. Order to delivery dropped from 2 hours to under 2 minutes. The village elder arrived, grateful and weeping. He asked me to help organize the festival. I agreed. The festival preparations were gridlocked by barter. A fisherman wanted coconuts, but the coconut seller wanted spices, not fish. I produced a mana coin, demonstrated the currency cycle, and injected liquidity from Demon Holdings. Trade flowed. The elder asked about the traditional massage. I observed a session. A bear beastman offered to stomp my spine with his full weight. "Stop," I said. Alice projected anatomy textbooks from the castle's database. I trained them for hours. Proper pressure points, weight transfer through center of gravity, not brute force. Cat beastmen learned lymph massage using their natural paw pads. By sunset, a bear gave me a textbook-perfect shoulder treatment while a cat worked my calves. I leaned back in the beach chair. The sun was going down. The waves were steady. The breeze carried salt and warm fruit. For the first time in 12 phases, I closed my eyes. The eyes did not stay closed. A kraken emerged from the bay the next morning, drawn by the noise of tens of thousands of employees. Zane drew his sword. Gant reached for his hammer. "Stand down," I said. I connected my calculator to a translation spell and opened negotiations. The kraken was angry about the noise and hungry. I offered high-grade meat from the castle freezer, teleported by Alice. In exchange, the kraken would generate regular wave patterns for surfing and produce calm ambient ocean sound for sleeping. The kraken accepted. It demanded 2 days off per week. I granted paid leave. The kraken became the resort's wave pool manager. Zane surfed the artificial waves for the rest of the morning. I returned to my chair with the massage, the cold juice, and the rhythmic sound of professionally managed tides. Then, Viper walked over with his lawbook. The Kingdom Navy's 7th Fleet had arrived. Dozens of warships on the horizon. A commander demanded through a magic amplifier that Demon Holdings evacuate the island immediately, claiming historical territorial rights. I did not get up from my chair. "Viper, legally repel them. Bonus applies." Viper walked to the shoreline, amplified his voice, and delivered a legal dismantling that lasted 4 minutes. The kingdom had never exercised effective control. No administrative institutions, no economic infrastructure, no population registry. Demon Holdings, by contrast, had established a mana economy, hired local residents, invested in infrastructure, and signed a contract with the island's guardian kraken. The island was private property under effective control commercial law. Any shot fired would trigger a damage claim in the trillions. The fleet hesitated. The commander tried to call it a bluff. Viper cited 3 additional statutes. The fleet withdrew toward the capital. I made a note to include the bonus in this quarter's expenses. Then I went back to sleep. The sleep lasted 1 night. Mina had posted resort photos to the realm's social network. Millions of likes. Nobles from across the kingdom chartered ships to visit. A duke offered 1 million mana per night for the best suite. I considered refusing. The island was supposed to be my rest. Then Alice showed me the incoming offers on her terminal and I saw the numbers. "Tell them it is invitation only. All prices are market rate," I said. I sold my quiet for a profit margin over 99%. The nobles arrived expecting luxury. I gave them coconut juice at 50,000 mana per glass, deck chairs at 100,000 per day, kraken surfing at 300,000. They paid because not paying meant admitting they could not afford it. and a noble's reputation was worth more than his treasury. When they complained about nighttime entertainment, Alice and I built a casino in 36 hours. An absolute fairness barrier nullified all magic and physical tricks inside. No cheating needed. The house edge was built into the mathematics, and the law of large numbers did the rest. By morning, we had recovered 99% of the noble's total funds. They left the island too broke for return fuel. That seemed fine to me. The emergency feed interrupted my reading. Back at the Demon Castle, Kane and Alvin had gone on strike at the energy department. They had seen Mina's photos. They wanted to see the sea. Purification efficiency had dropped to critical levels. I activated the hologram. Kane was standing with his arms crossed, refusing to channel. Alvin was beside him, stamping his feet, demanding a beach. "Calm down," I said. "Consider this a company benefit." Alice unlocked a prototype from the third development lab, a full immersion visual projection device. She transferred it to their station along with a premium beach simulation game, complete edition, all content included. The two of them put on the goggles. Kane went quiet. Alvin started shouting about a tropical event with maximum affinity bonuses. The purification efficiency meter climbed past 100%, then past 110. It settled at 120. For indoor-type employees, a perfectly calibrated virtual beach was apparently superior to the real thing. Alice reported the numbers. I turned off the communication device and lay back down. The man who had fired me 3 years ago was now on strike against me over vacation policy, and I had solved it with a video game. Something about that felt like it deserved a longer pause than I gave it, but the waves were good, and the juice was cold, and I had a book to finish. Zane found me on the third week. He was bored. He had surfed every wave, eaten every fruit, and exhausted every form of relaxation the island offered. He wanted work. "Send me somewhere useful," he said, standing over my chair in his aloha shirt, sword still at his hip. "I'm the Demon King. I should be doing something." I looked at the investor pipeline Alice had compiled. New ultra-premium visitors had been arriving daily. Institutional money, the kind that signed contracts with 8-figure floors. "Go to the investor briefing tent," I said. "You are now our top sales executive. Talk about the company's vision. Be yourself." Zane walked into the tent. Within 5 minutes, he had terrified 3 institutional investors into committing 3 trillion mana in new funding. He told them that anyone who stood in the company's path would be physically removed by him personally, and that all legal obstacles would be rewritten by Viper, and that the market itself would belong to Demon Holdings within a decade. The investors read this as a monopoly pitch backed by credible force. They signed before he finished his juice. Alice showed me the confirmation receipts. 3 trillion, from a man who did not know what a profit margin was. I thanked Zane through the communication channel. He was already laughing with the investors, who were laughing back in the way people laugh when they are not sure if the person across the table might eat them. The vacation ended. 1 month. We boarded Demon Airlines for the return flight. The employees were tanned, rested, satisfied. Gant's edge was back. Mina was still photographing the departure. The islanders gathered at the shore. The village elder bowed deeply. The cat beastman waved mana banknotes and shouted that the spa was booming. Offshore, the Kraken raised a tentacle in what I chose to interpret as a professional farewell. I sat in my designated chair on the observation deck and opened the final profit report on my calculator. The numbers arranged themselves in clean columns, and every column was wrong. The vacation was supposed to be an expense, a line item under employee welfare that reduced quarterly earnings by the exact amount of the approved budget. Instead, the dynamic pricing had generated several trillion mana. The casino had absorbed the noble's entire liquid wealth. Zane's investor calls had secured 3 trillion in new commitments. The resort itself was now a fully operational subsidiary with a valuation I could not put a ceiling on. Total result, a 300% profit increase over the prior period. The month I had designed for rest had become the highest margin operation in the company's history. I stared at the number. Then I scrolled down. Below the profit summary was a photo collage Mina had attached to the report. Company trip highlights, she had labeled it. I scrolled through. Mina standing with Celestia on the beach. Celestia had taken a brief leave from her duties in Elysian. She was smiling in a way I had not seen before, standing ankle deep in the surf, holding her shoes in one hand. Mina had her arm around her shoulder. Kane and Alvin on the VR couch in the underground station, both wearing the immersion goggles. Kane was leaning back with his arms behind his head. Alvin was mid-shout, controller raised, clearly winning something. The purification gauge behind them read 120%. The undead workers on a paid leave excursion to a coastal town. A group photo. They were waving. Someone in the back row was holding a small flag that said, Employee of the Year. Below the image, Mina had listed their names. Every one of them. I read the names. They had worked for necrostaff for centuries, under predatory contracts with no pay, no breaks, no identity. Now they had names on a company photo and a flag and a beach trip. I had freed them with a 1 mana acquisition and a stack of revised employment forms. That was phase 4. It felt like a different century. Alice and me in a small shot at sunset. I did not remember the photo being taken. We were sitting on the beach, not looking at each other, not talking, just sitting. Her pudding cup was balanced on her knee. My glasses were folded in my hand. The light was the kind that makes ordinary things look like they were always supposed to be that way. Mina had not captioned it. Zane mid-investor call. Aloha, shirt open, sword on the table. 3 terrified nobles across from him. His mouth was open in what was either a sales pitch or a war cry. The nobles were smiling the way hostages smile. I closed the collage. I had wanted 1 week of actual vacation. That was the request I had filed internally, somewhere around phase 6, when the walls were closing in and the castle had no power and the hero's party was scattered across a continent. 1 week, no audits, no filings, no hostile takeovers, no compliance manuals, no Kraken contracts, no casino mathematics, just a chair and a book and a drink that was cold when it arrived. I withdrew the request, not because it was denied, because it was structurally impossible. Every chair I sat in became an office. Every drink I ordered exposed a supply chain I could not leave broken. Every beach I visited generated a profit center I could not ignore. The wound was not that nobody saw what I did. The wound was that I could not stop doing it. The fortress hummed beneath me. Kane's mana flowed through the propulsion array, steady and infinite, powering the flight home from a station where he was currently winning a beach volleyball tournament that did not exist. Alvin was beside him, losing. The undead workers were asleep in their suites with their paid leave flags tucked under their pillows. Gant was on the bridge, watching the horizon. Viper was in his cabin, reading case law, because even on the flight home, he could not stop either. Alice was at the helm. The math was clean. 300%, 15 trillion mana in market capitalization, 70% of the kingdom running on infrastructure we built, a resort subsidiary, a mana currency zone, a Kraken on payroll, a hero and a reincarnator playing video games in the basement, a dragon somewhere in the investor briefing queue, a vampire checking her dividend yield, a saint standing ankle deep in the ocean for the first time in years. I had been awake too long. The fortress flew home. I noted that the stars were the same ones I had seen from my old desk, back when I was the man behind the counter, filing receipts for a hero who never learned my name. I noted.